Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Linen Wars, Flanders, France and the Fabric of Power. You are standing on the muddy roads of 14th century Flanders. The sky above is a permanent gray, and the damp air clings to wool cloaks like moss to stone. This is no battlefield, no court of kings. And yet, here in the spinning rooms, weaving workshops, and market stalls, Europe was waging one of its quietest but most enduring economic wars, the struggle for dominance in the linen trade. The linen that tied everything together. Before cotton conquered closets and synthetic fibers defined the 21st century, linen was the fabric of choice for much of Europe. Derived from the humble flax plant, linen was prized for its breathability, durability, and utility. It clothed peasants and priests alike, bandaged wounds, lined armor, and was even used as currency in some barter economies. And Flanders, specifically the cities of Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges, was the heart of it. But how did linen become such a source of conflict? In medieval Europe, wealth flowed through trade, and trade depended not just on supply and demand, but on monopolies, charters, and guild protections. As the demand for fine cloth grew across Europe's courts and cities, so too did the power of those who could spin, dye, and sell it. Flanders, with its proximity to English wool and continental markets, held an advantageous position. But England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire all had their eyes and their tariffs trained on this unassuming region. Weavers and warhorses. To understand the significance of the linen industry, we must talk about control. In Flanders, the powerful weaving guilds governed more than just their craft. They wielded real political clout. Masters in the cities could dictate wages, influence local laws, and sometimes defy their own lords. One notable figure was Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy cloth merchant in Ghent who, in the early 14th century, led the city in a semi-republican revolt. Under his leadership, Ghent rejected the Count of Flanders' allegiance to the French crown and instead aligned itself with England largely to secure access to English wool. It wasn't an ideological revolution. It was about yarn. England needed Flemish weavers to maintain the value of its wool exports. France wanted to pull Flanders into its orbit. The result was a back-and-forth struggle of embargoes, uprisings, and trade treaties, what some modern historians refer to as the Linen Wars. There were no armies with banners, but economic sieges were just as crippling. A town cut off from English wool could see its entire population thrown into poverty in a matter of months. Threads of power and patronage. What made this economic war even more tangled was the involvement of aristocratic women. Noblewomen across Europe, particularly in France and the Low Countries, were patrons of flax-growing and linen-weaving communities. Many even managed their estates' textile production. Their letters, some preserved, reveal concerns not about political alliances, but about dye quality, thread count, and delivery schedules. One 14th century countess from Hainaut wrote repeatedly to her estate manager about delays in finishing her household's summer linen, noting that the flax was underwashed and poorly beaten. Linen was a household concern, but in a world where households were microeconomies and noble families the backbone of regional politics, the domestic became political. And beyond the nobility, the average Flemish weaver man or woman was more economically informed than many modern consumers. These workers understood exchange rates, tariffs, and the subtle changes in wool quality from different English counties. They were not just laborers. They were participants in a pan-European system of value and power. The bureaucracy of bolts. The linen trade generated more than fabric. It produced paperwork. Cities like Bruges kept meticulous records of bolts of cloth inspected, taxed, and exported. There were length inspectors, thread counters, and color regulators. Misweaving wasn't just an error, it was a punishable offense. and cloth that failed to meet guild standards could be seized and burned. This gave rise to an entire class of linen officials. Some were local artisans promoted through guild ranks. Others were appointed by ducal courts, often as a form of patronage. These men, usually men, could be both feared and bribed. There are quiet cases in the archives of fines waived, cloth passed despite visible defects, and entire shipments mysteriously lost. This world of inspection and certification might seem tedious, and it was, but it was also critical. A merchant in Milan needed to trust that a bolt of linen labeled Ghent dyed met expectations. That trust relied on a bureaucracy built on boring documentation, month after month, for centuries. Storms on the horizon. But nothing remains peaceful in a continent of crowned ambitions. By the end of the 14th century, new tensions were rising. The 100 Years' War between England and France, once only tangential to Flemish concerns, began to squeeze the region. Trade routes were threatened, and merchants had to navigate not just sea storms but shifting political loyalties. Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres were rich but vulnerable. France sought to assert greater control over the region. England, unwilling to lose its economic foothold, began to explore alternative markets. And in the east, smaller textile centers were beginning to emerge in the German principalities. Would Flanders hold its place as the continent's textile heart? Or would the linen that once bound it to Europe unravel under the weight of politics and war? That question was increasingly urgent as the 15th century approached. You returned to Flanders, not as a visitor this time, but as someone caught in the tightening threads of a geopolitical tapestry. The 14th century is closing, and the flax fields still sway in the wind, but their calm hides deeper unrest. The linen trade, once the pride of the region, is now becoming a fault line between rival powers. The people of Flanders, once masters of their own weaving fortunes, now find themselves entangled in something more perilous than trade wars: the ambitions of kings. The 100 Years' War comes to the workshop. It's easy to think of the 100 Years' War as a series of battles between France and England, featuring names like Agincourt or Poitiers. But for the people of Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges, it was something different entirely. It was a war of wool embargoes, shifting tariffs, forced oaths, and militarized trade routes. The Counts of Flanders were vassals to the King of France, yet many of their cities, particularly Ghent and Bruges, relied heavily on English wool to power their economy. When Philip VI of France attempted to cut off English influence in the region, local merchants and guild leaders rebelled not out of loyalty to England, but from fear of economic collapse. Ghent's powerful weavers' guild led the resistance. Their logic was clear: no English wool meant no work meant poverty. The slogan might have been dull, but it was deadly accurate: no wool, no bread. Jacob van Artevelde's gambit. In this fragile moment, the cloth merchant Jacob van Artevelde once again took the stage. A respected figure among the merchant class, Van Artevelde was no revolutionary firebrand. He was pragmatic, deliberate, and very wealthy. In 1338, with the threat of a French invasion looming and the local nobility paralyzed by indecision, Van Artevelde negotiated directly with England. He brokered a controversial agreement. Flanders would remain officially neutral, but its ports would welcome English wool. In return, Edward III of England would offer protection to the cities and support their trade. This was not treason. Van Artevelde insisted it was survival. To enforce this neutrality, Van Artevelde created what was essentially a shadow government in Ghent. He established councils made up of merchants, guild leaders, and artisans. Together, they managed everything from trade permits to food supplies to militia patrols. It was bureaucratic, inefficient, and riddled with internal conflict, but it worked. For a time, linen flowed. Bolts of finely woven fabric returned to the markets of Paris, Milan, and Cologne. The poor found work again. Bread prices stabilized. Van Artevelde became known as the Wise Man of Ghent. But peace born of neutrality never lasts in a continent of kings. The crown strikes back. France, deeply insulted and economically threatened by Ghent's behavior, retaliated in less direct ways. They sanctioned Flemish nobles who supported Van Artevelde's rule, withheld grain shipments to certain cities, and sponsored rival guild leaders willing to stir dissent. They also began courting the Count of Flanders, Louis I, promising him greater autonomy if he would bring his cities back into line. Meanwhile, England grew impatient. Edward III, still at war with France, began pressing Van Artevelde to do more than remain neutral. He wanted a full alliance. In 1340, he declared himself the legitimate king of France, a move Van Artevelde dared not support, at least not publicly. His carefully balanced alliance began to wobble. The people of Ghent, once united behind their merchant leader, grew restless. Food shortages returned, taxes increased to fund the city's militias, and rumors spread that Van Artevelde was growing too close to the English crown. In a brutal twist of fate, the man who had preserved their livelihoods was now accused of endangering them. In 1345, Van Artevelde was murdered by a mob, some say workers who blamed him for fresh hardships. Others whisper it was a political assassination sanctioned by French loyalists. Either way, the threads he had held together for nearly a decade finally unraveled. Linen and the rise of Bruges. With Van Artevelde gone and Ghent in turmoil, another city quietly stepped into the foreground, Bruges. While Ghent had relied on political defiance, Bruges played a slower, subtler game. It positioned itself as a neutral trade hub, one that welcomed merchants from England, France, Italy, and even the distant Baltic. The city council invested heavily in port improvements and even negotiated protection from pirate fleets. Its secret, not military might or political cunning, but diplomacy and accounting. Bruges became the quiet capital of the European textile trade. Italian bankers from Lombardy set up counting houses. Hanseatic merchants from Lubeck and Hamburg established shipping routes. The Bourse of Bruges, the world's first real stock exchange, began to take shape, offering a place for textile futures, credit trading, and currency exchange. What had started as a conflict over bolts of linen had now evolved into something larger. A regional economy capable of shaping European politics through coin rather than cannon. And yet this success too came with a cost. A hidden casualty, the flax farmer. Beneath all of this, beneath the merchants, the guilds, the monarchs were the flax farmers. The best linen came from long-stemmed flax grown in the rich, damp soil of Flanders. But these farmers were increasingly squeezed by market pressures. Urban workshops demanded more raw material at lower prices. Export tariffs on flaxseed shifted with every treaty. Some years, farmers were encouraged to grow flax. Other years, they were paid to switch to grain, only to be punished when linen prices soared again. There are quiet records often tucked into ecclesiastical accounts of peasant revolts in the countryside. These were not grand uprisings. No castles were stormed. But small groups of farmers refused to pay linen taxes, blocked merchant roads, or burned way stations. Monasteries tried to intervene, often unsuccessfully. A few monks from the Abbey of St. Bavo wrote bitterly in their chronicles of the restless flaxfolk, people who had no understanding of order and patience. But the truth was simpler. The people growing the flax were watching their lives shrink to feed the ambitions of cities. In one preserved letter from a Flemish abbot, a frustrated nobleman writes, "I have tenants who pay me in thread now rather than coin, and when the thread is thin, they say it is the fault of rain or seed, but it is I who feel the hunger." The fabric of Flemish power was quite literally being pulled from the soil, and that soil was growing tired. New weavers on the horizon. By the early 15th century, Flanders, dominance in the linen trade, was facing new competition. Towns in northern Italy, such as Milan and Bologna, began developing their own weaving industries. In the east, German principalities sponsored textile production in Silesia and Saxony. And most significantly, England, once merely the supplier of wool, began building its own workshops, aiming to end its dependency on Flemish weavers altogether. What had once been Flanders' economic weapon was now a shared European tool. The linen wars, if one can still call them that, were no longer about one region's dominance. They were about adaptation, survival, and the bureaucratic reshuffling of trade alliances. But Flanders was not finished, not yet. Its cities remained wealthy, its merchants clever, and its weavers still among the best in Europe. Still, the question loomed: could Flanders reinvent itself before the very system it had built left it behind? You return to the towns of Flanders now not as an observer of an industry in motion, but as a witness to its slow, bureaucratic unraveling. The flax still grows in the countryside, and the looms still beat rhythmically in the cities, but something has changed. The linen trade, once the driver of an entire region's prosperity and independence, has become a relic of its own success. The guilds have grown rigid. The markets, once bustling, feel stagnant. And beyond the borders of Flanders, the world is changing. When the machines begin to whisper. It is now the 15th century, and in the German principalities to the east, whispers begin to spread about something new: mechanization. Not steam or steel, those are centuries away, but rudimentary water-powered devices that assist in flax breaking and thread spinning. These inventions are small, clunky, and expensive, but they signal a shift. Technology, not guild tradition, will determine the pace of production. Flemish guilds resist these changes. In cities like Ypres, legislation is passed forbidding the use of mechanized spinning devices within the city walls. The argument is simple: machines threaten the livelihoods of skilled workers. To preserve quality, tradition must be maintained. But outside the city walls, in smaller towns and independent workshops, entrepreneurs begin experimenting. Some adapt the new devices to spin lesser quality flax for export to distant markets. Others move their operations entirely, seeking locations with fewer regulatory constraints. This creates a quiet migration of capital, knowledge, and people away from the historic linen centers of Flanders. Bruges, once the uncontested queen of textile commerce, begins to lose its grip. The rise of Antwerp and the new order. By the late 15th century, Antwerp is on the rise. Located along the Scheldt River and increasingly favored by international merchants, it offers something Flanders cannot: flexibility. While Bruges clings to its guild charters, Antwerp opens its gates to foreign traders. It becomes a hub for not just linen but spices, sugar, and silver. Merchants there care less about the exact thread count of a bolt of cloth and more about the speed of delivery and the breadth of the market. For the linen cities of Flanders, this is a turning point. They are no longer at the center of European commerce. They are now competitors in a broader and more volatile game. Guild leaders in Ghent and Ypres attempt reforms. Some allow limited mechanization. Others try to modernize their inspection systems, creating faster ways to certify cloth. But it is often too little, too late. Foreign markets, once reliant on Flemish linen, now have options cheaper, faster, and in some cases, better tailored to changing tastes. Still, there remains a quiet dignity in the old ways. Flemish weavers continue to produce some of the finest linen in Europe, using traditional methods. Their work is still valued, but the days of regional dominance are over. The social cost of stagnation. As trade slows, the economic pain begins to spread. The flax farmers are the first to feel it. With demand falling, prices drop. Some turn to other crops. Others abandon their plots altogether. Peasant families that once scraped a living selling flax to guild workshops now move to cities, hopping for employment. But the cities, struggling under the weight of bureaucracy and shrinking markets, cannot absorb them. Urban unemployment rises, so too does unrest. In Ghent, the guilds begin to fracture. Journeymen protest against masters who refuse to lower entrance barriers. In Ypres, a quiet wave of emigration begins. Skilled weavers leave for England, Italy, and the emerging cities of the Holy Roman Empire, taking their knowledge with them. The worst comes during the early 16th century, when war once again sweeps through the region. The 80 Years' War between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Dutch rebels turns much of the Low Countries into a battleground. Flanders, caught between loyalties and armies, suffers immensely. Entire towns are sacked, trade routes collapse, fields are burned. In Bruges, one merchant writes in 1576, "The bales of cloth remain packed, no ship dares sail, even the rats are leaving." The linen wars, once fought in courts and counting houses, now return to blood and ash. The echoes of empire. While all of this unfolds, something remarkable is happening across the Atlantic. The Americas, newly colonized by European powers, begin producing cotton on a scale previously unimaginable. Cheap slave labor, vast plantations, and favorable climates make cotton a rival to linen. It's not yet a full replacement. Linen remains essential in colder climates and for specialized uses, but the shift has begun. Linen, once the lifeblood of European trade, now competes with cotton produced half a world away under a system far removed from guild oversight or moral consideration. The people of Flanders, who once dictated European fashion and fabric flow, are now participants in a global system they no longer control. One historian would later write that Flanders taught Europe how to weave, and was then forgotten when it learned to sew elsewhere. It is a brutal, quiet decline. The fabric's final lessons. Yet the story does not end in despair. Even as their economic power wanes, the Flemish cities remain cultural centers. Their architecture, built with linen profits, survives. Their guild records become rich sources for historians, detailing the minutiae of production, trade, and life. The linen itself, remarkably durable, endures in museums and archives, its fibers holding secrets centuries old. And the methods of Flemish weavers influenced textile industries for generations. The guild structures, with all their flaws, create some of the earliest examples of regulated labor, quality control, and worker solidarity. Even the bureaucracy so often blamed for the industry's ossification paves the way for modern regulatory systems. Tax rolls, trade charters, and merchant logs from 14th century Flanders would one day influence Enlightenment economists trying to make sense of commerce and statecraft. There's something strangely poetic in that. The systems built to maintain the linen trade outlasted the trade itself. A thought for the modern listener. Today, as you sit surrounded by mass-produced textiles and global supply chains, it's easy to forget how deeply something as simple as a sheet of linen once shaped the course of history. It's not the material itself, but the systems it required, economic, social, and political, that transformed kingdoms and shaped lives. So the next time you see an old flax field in northern France, or walk through the preserved medieval streets of Bruges or Ghent, remember, the fabric of history is often woven by quiet hands, and sometimes those hands shape the world more than kings or wars. But here's a question that still lingers centuries later. If the threads of Flanders could unravel so silently, what other foundations of power today rest on fabrics just as fragile? Story 2. The Cow Tax Revolts, Agrarian Resistance in the Habsburg Netherlands. You're standing now in the damp flatlands of the Habsburg Netherlands, sometime around the early 16th century. This is no battlefield, no capital of empire. It's a field not particularly large, not particularly fertile, where a single cow chews slowly beneath a gray northern sky. Her placid gaze betrays nothing of the conflict unfolding around her. But this cow, and thousands like her, will soon become the center of a peasant rebellion. not over land, nor over bread, but over taxes. An empire of ledgers and livestock. By the early 1500s, the Habsburgs had become one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Through a complex web of marriages, inheritances, and wars, they ruled vast swaths of territory, including the Low Countries, a rich and restive collection of provinces roughly corresponding to modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. These provinces were, in theory, loyal to the Habsburg Emperor at this time, Charles V, but in practice, they were fiercely protective of their local privileges. Each city and province had its own traditions, charters, and laws, many dating back to medieval times. Local assemblies called estates held sway over taxation, and any imperial request for money had to be negotiated, not imposed. Still, empires cost money, and Charles V had wars to fight, against France, against the Ottoman Empire, and against Protestant reformers spreading unrest across his lands. He needed new sources of income. And so, in 1529, his officials proposed a new kind of tax, a levy on cattle. It seemed simple. Every farmer who owned cows would pay a set fee per animal. It was a predictable, recurring tax, easy to assess, and fair at least in the minds of the bureaucrats in Brussels. But they had misjudged the people who lived with cows, counting cows in a suspicious world. For the farmers of the Habsburg Netherlands, particularly in the rural regions of Flanders and Brabant, cattle were more than just livestock. A cow was wealth, a dowry, a source of milk, manure, and meat. Cows were currency in an agrarian economy where coinage was rare, and they were integrated into every aspect of social life. To tax cows, then, was not simply to collect money. It was to enter the household to assign value to a living creature that could be sick, old, pregnant, or sacred to a family's survival. Even worse, the new tax required surveys. Officials would come to villages, record the number of cattle owned, and calculate the tax accordingly. To many villagers, this was not just invasive, it was deeply suspicious. Rumors spread quickly that the tax was a prelude to forced requisitioning, that herds would be seized if payments were late, that more taxes would follow. In a world without newspapers or official explanations, word of mouth became law. And then there was the indignity of it all, that a bureaucrat from the city, often a younger man with no farming experience, might walk into your barn, count your cows, and tell you what you owed without ever asking how much milk they gave or how many mouths you had to feed. It felt like an insult wrapped in red tape. The cow as a symbol of resistance. The protests began as passive resistance. Farmers hid cows in neighboring villages, swapped them with relatives, or kept them in woods during inspections. Tax collectors reported wildly inconsistent numbers. One day, a village had 200 cattle, the next only 15. This created chaos in the ledgers. Some towns were fined for noncompliance. Others were placed under threat of imperial sanctions, but the farmers didn't back down. In fact, they grew bolder. In 1530, in the small village of Guick in Brabant, a tax collector named Pieter van Malsen was run out of town by angry farmers wielding manure forks and fence posts. His ledgers were thrown into a pond. No one was killed, but the message was clear: leave the cows alone. Word spread. Similar incidents cropped up across the countryside. In some villages, farmers staged symbolic cow funerals, parading paper effigies of dead cows through the streets to mock the tax. Others scrawled messages on barn doors. No telling, no tax, a simple slogan, but one that captured the mood. Local officials, many of whom were landowners themselves, sympathized with the farmers. Some even quietly encouraged resistance. In several provinces, estates formally protested the tax, arguing it had not been properly approved. Charles V's imperial government was not amused, but it was also preoccupied with Lutheran uprisings in the German states and battles with Francis I of France. The cow tax seemed small compared to the fires blazing elsewhere. So the policy lingered unevenly enforced, widely resisted, and quietly eroding imperial credibility. The bureaucracy pushes back. By 1534, the government tried again, this time with refinements. New officials were trained to conduct anonymous livestock assessments. Villages were told that if they refused entry, they would face collective fines. In some regions, a cow census was proposed, with cowbells to be registered and taxed based on sound alone, an impractical, almost laughable idea that nonetheless shows how far the bureaucracy was willing to go. Predictably, this only fueled the resistance. In the town of Tilt, one brave farmer reportedly placed cowbells on all his chickens and pigs, demanding the officials count those instead. In another village, officials arrived to find every cow dressed in a hat and cloak, labeled with false names and dates of birth. These acts of protest were funny, but behind the humor was a deeper tension. Between centralized imperial rule and local autonomy, between a bureaucratic view of resources and a human view of survival. The bigger picture, a restless peasantry. The cow tax revolt may seem trivial next to wars and treaties, but it was part of a broader trend. Across Europe in the 16th century, peasants were growing increasingly resistant to top-down control. The German peasants' War of the 1520s had rocked the Holy Roman Empire. In France, tax revolts flared up whenever royal demands outpaced local patience. Even in England, the Pilgrimage of Grace, 1536, saw rural communities rise against perceived intrusions into traditional life. In the Low Countries, the cow tax became a touchstone. It embodied everything people feared about the expanding imperial system: distant rule, arbitrary demands, and disregard for local custom. And yet, unlike other uprisings, the resistance here remained largely nonviolent and deeply rooted in everyday life. It was fought not with swords, but with silence, subterfuge, and satire. That made it harder to suppress and harder to ignore. A tax repealed, a message sent. Eventually, the imperial government relented. By the early 1540s, after more than a decade of ineffective enforcement, the cow tax was quietly withdrawn in most provinces. In its place, more traditional levies like tolls and excise taxes were reintroduced, albeit with greater negotiation. No grand declaration was made, no victory was announced, but the message had been sent and received: you cannot govern cows from a castle. The rural resistance had achieved something remarkable, not by overthrowing a regime, but by preserving autonomy through persistent, quiet defiance. One official writing from Leuven in 1542 described the situation bluntly. The people are not rebellious, they are immovable. One cannot reason with a barn door that does not open. A closing thought. In the end, the cow tax revolts were not about cows at all, not really. They were about trust and the delicate line between governance and intrusion. They were about how states tried to measure life in ledgers and how people push back with stories, stubbornness, and satire. So as you settle into sleep, consider this. If you had a cow and someone tried to tax it, what would you do? Hide it, fight, or dress it in a cloak and name it Charles? You return again to the sodden fields and winding village lanes of the Habsburg Netherlands, but this time with an eye on something deeper than cows and complaints. Beneath the protests, the mockery, and the manure-soaked refusal to comply with the cow tax, a quieter story unfolds, one of administrative overreach, local resilience, and the early stirrings of something that looked a little like modern political consciousness. Because in truth, the resistance to the cow tax was never really just about cattle. It was about control, representation, and the growing realization that even the smallest rural voices could shape or stall imperial ambition. The local lords, neither here nor there. To understand the full tension of the cow tax, One must look at the strange middle layer of power in the 16th century Low Countries, the local nobility and civic elites. These were not emperors or kings, nor were they common peasants. They were landowners, burghers, sheriffs, and members of town councils who operated in the ambiguous space between the imperial court in Brussels and the farmers in the fields. Often, they had as much to lose from imperial taxation as the villagers they governed. A bad tax poorly explained, unfairly enforced, or simply too aggressive could provoke unrest that disrupted not just trade but the entire social contract. In places like Leuven, Mechelen, and Breda, these local elites did something remarkable. They refused to enforce the cow tax. Not openly, at first, but they quietly misplaced assessment orders. They delayed the formation of tax committees. They wrote letters to higher authorities, carefully worded appeals in Latin, arguing that the local economy could not bear another burden. In some regions, they created a system of shadow compliance, claiming the tax was being collected while no such revenue ever arrived. When questioned, they blamed poor weather, cattle illness, or vague logistical errors. This passive resistance created a bureaucratic headache for Brussels, and more importantly, it emboldened the peasants. If even the landlords were stalling, maybe the cow tax wasn't inevitable after all. Lanterns in the night. And so began the next phase of resistance, not just avoidance, but organized evasion. Villages began to hold secret meetings, often in barns or taverns, to coordinate how to hide livestock, what to say to tax agents, and how to move cows across district lines before inspections. These weren't revolutionaries. These were farmers and herders, many of whom could not read or write, but they understood logistics. In one small town in Flanders, lanterns were used as a signal system. One lantern in a window meant tax officials had arrived. 2 meant they were headed toward the fields. 3 meant they had already passed, and the cows could be brought back. In another region, oxen were covered in soot or painted with tar to make them look sickly and unfit for taxation. Entire herds were disguised as plow animals or declared to be owned by absent relatives. The empire responded, of course. Penalties were introduced for obstruction. Fines were increased. In some cases, troops were dispatched to troublesome districts not to arrest anyone but to intimidate. But these attempts at enforcement often backfired. Soldiers were not trained accountants. They couldn't distinguish between a milk cow and a sick one, nor did they understand the rhythms of rural life. Their presence often disrupted planting schedules and church feasts, further alienating the population. The archive tells its tale. Today, historians are able to piece together the absurd, drawn-out saga of the cow tax through one of the empire's greatest legacies, its paper trail. The Habsburg administration, for all its faults, was diligent in its record-keeping. Thousands of pages survive in the archives of Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. Letters from frustrated tax commissioners. Reports detailing villages with suspiciously few livestock. Petitions from farmers claiming their only cow had died, often using nearly identical phrasing. One particularly revealing document comes from 1537. It lists 27 villages in Flanders where no revenue had been collected in 3 years, despite repeated assessments. The official who compiled it, an exasperated clerk named Willem van der Molen, added a final note at the bottom. These people do not lie, but they certainly do not tell the truth. We count cows, and they count us in return. There is something almost poetic in that sentence, a resigned recognition that governance, even in its most meticulous form, could not override local cunning. Provincial pushback. Meanwhile, the provincial estates, the assemblies representing nobles, clergy, and towns, began to weigh in more forcefully. In Brabant, the estates declared that no new taxes could be levied without their explicit approval, citing ancient charters. In Flanders, cities like Ghent and Bruges issued formal complaints to the emperor's court, framing the cow tax not as a financial burden but as a constitutional violation. This is where the revolt takes on a deeper tone. The argument had shifted from, "We don't want to pay," to, "You have no right to make us pay." This was a legal and political challenge to the very structure of Habsburg rule. And while Charles V did not formally concede the point, his council in Brussels became increasingly reluctant to escalate the issue. No one wanted another rebellion, not while the empire was already fighting on multiple fronts across Europe. And so, the tax remained on the books, but enforcement grew weaker. In some places, it vanished entirely. In others, it was quietly replaced with indirect levies tolls on grain, market fees, or customs duties that didn't require entering someone's barn. A new kind of memory. In time, the cow tax revolts faded from imperial concern, but they did not vanish from local memory. In village folklore, tales of clever cow hiding became legends. Songs were composed, most of them lost, though fragments survive in local dialects. In some towns, children played a game involving hiding small wooden cows while one player, the taxman, tried to find them. It may sound quaint, but this kind of memory matters. It preserved the idea that resistance was possible and that it didn't always have to be bloody. It could be bureaucratic, subtle, even funny. For the rural communities of the Habsburg Netherlands, this legacy planted seeds that would later blossom in more coordinated resistance, especially during the Dutch Revolt that began in the 1560s. The cow tax had not started a revolution, but it had revealed a truth. You do not need swords to weaken a crown. Sometimes, all it takes is a missing cow and a clever story. An unresolved thought. And yet, one must wonder, what did the empire learn from this? Was it humbled, or did it simply learn to count more discreetly? Did the cow tax die quietly, or did it live on, reshaped into more palatable forms? Perhaps the cow was never truly freed, only renamed. You return once more to the lowland villages of the Habsburg Netherlands, where fields stretch wide under gray skis and cows graze with timeless indifference. The revolts are long past now. No more mock parades of painted cattle. No more lanterns flickering warnings through misty barns. The cow tax has faded into the paperwork of history, but its consequences still ripple quietly beneath the surface. What was left behind was not a rebellion in the conventional sense, no grand declarations, no bloody barricades. What was left behind was a deeper, more enduring change, a new understanding of power, how it could be questioned, and how it could be resisted not with violence, but with cleverness, cooperation, and community. From resistance to routine. By the mid-16th century, the cow tax had essentially vanished. Officially, some regions still maintained it in theory, but in practice, enforcement had become nearly impossible. The imperial government, facing far more urgent crises such as the rising tide of Protestant dissent and the slow-burning Dutch revolt, no longer had the appetite for chasing tax records through muddy fields. Instead, new forms of revenue were introduced: customs duties, port fees, and commodity taxes. These were easier to collect, harder to hide from, and importantly less personal. You didn't have to open your barn to pay a toll on beer or salt. The authorities could tax trade, not household life. In a way, this was a victory for the rural communities, but it also signaled a change in imperial strategy: make taxation impersonal. No more counting cows, just count coin. And yet, the echoes of the revolt lingered. In town councils and village meetings, discussions of taxes now often included phrases like, "Remember the cattle years," or "We will not be measured like beasts again." The cow tax had become a historical reference point, a shorthand for overreach and the limits of imperial legitimacy. The unseen threads of political maturity. The cow tax resistance might not have seemed radical at the time, but it laid the groundwork for something approaching political maturity in the countryside. Three subtle but significant transformations began to take root. One shared rural consciousness. Villages that had once been isolated began to coordinate. Farmers from different provinces shared tactics and information. Local leaders traveled between towns to help coordinate evasion strategies. Oral histories became political tools, carrying news and lessons across generations. This wasn't nationalism. It wasn't even organized protest in the modern sense, but it was a shared awareness. We have something in common beyond our parish walls. 2. Skepticism toward central authority. The experience taught rural people that imperial power was not all-knowing or all-seeing. It could be tricked, it could be resisted, it could even be ignored. This kind of skepticism became a quiet strength in the decades to come. When Spanish troops arrived during the Dutch Revolt, many rural communities had already learned how to hide grain, move livestock, and spread information without detection. The skills honed in tax evasion would later serve in wartime survival. 3. Local administration as a buffer. Perhaps most importantly, the cow tax highlighted the importance of local governance. Town councils, rural sheriffs, and provincial estates had protected their people not through violence, but through procedural delay and legal argument. This reinforced a belief that local voices mattered, and that power was not absolute if it could be slowed, questioned, or circumvented. That idea would return, decades later, in much louder forms during the independence movements that rocked the Low Countries. The cow and the empire. And what of the empire? Did it learn anything? Yes and no. The Habsburg government became more sophisticated in taxation after the cow tax failure. They shifted to broader indirect taxes and worked more closely with merchant classes in urban centers. They learned that rural taxation must be dressed in market logic, not household inspection. But the cow tax had also revealed something uncomfortable: the limits of imperial reach. Despite its armies, its bureaucrats, its parchments and ledgers, the empire could not pierce the daily realities of peasant life without consent, or at least quiet compliance. It was a reminder that power, no matter how vast, still needed cooperation, and that once trust was broken, it was very hard to tax your way back into favor. A soft legacy. Today, the cow tax revolts are a footnote in most history books if they're mentioned at all. There are no monuments to the missing cattle of Brabant, no epic poems about the soot-covered cows of Flanders, but the story remains, tucked away in regional histories, folk tales, and dusty bureaucratic records. In some parts of rural Belgium, there are still colloquial phrases like, "as slippery as a cow taxer," or "he counts his cows too loudly," odd remnants of a time when animal ownership was a political act. And some of the very same towns that resisted imperial taxation in the 1500s would, centuries later, become hotbeds of union organization, socialist movements, and modern forms of civil resistance. The traditions of local coordination, mutual aid, and skepticism of central authority never quite disappeared. They simply changed costume. Final reflection. The cow tax revolts remind us that history is not always made by generals or kings. Sometimes, it's shaped by farmers who refuse to open a barn door, by neighbors who pass along rumors under lamplight, by communities who say, in their own quiet way, "We will not be measured like this." So as you let your thoughts drift into the fields of the past, consider: how many forms of quiet resistance still go unnoticed today? And how many barn doors remain closed not in defiance, but in defense of a life no ledger can fully capture? Story 3. The Clockmakers of Nuremberg: Time, Trade, and the Guild Economy. You find yourself now in the city of Nuremberg, in the middle of the 15th century. It is not a city of soaring cathedrals or conquering armies. Instead, It is a city of iron, gears, and soft ticking sounds, though most of those are too faint to hear above the clamor of hammers, bellows, and merchants' calls in the streets. This is not just any German city. This is Europe's workshop, and here, time itself is being reshaped not by philosophers but by clockmakers. Their work is meticulous. Their hands are blackened with oil and soot, but what they're doing is quietly revolutionary. They are making time portable, measurable, and mechanical. They are building machines to discipline the day. And in doing so, they're reshaping labor, trade, and the rhythms of European life one cog at a time. Before the clock, a world of bells and shadows. To understand the rise of clockmaking, you must first imagine a world before the personal measurement of time. For centuries, most people in Europe lived according to natural rhythms. The crowing of roosters, the position of the sun, the sound of monastery bells calling monks to prayer. In towns, a central bell tower might chime the canonical hours, matins, lauds, vespers based on broad approximations. But in villages, time was more fluid. People worked from dawn to dusk, until the light fades, or while the dew lasts. And for the most part, that was enough. But as cities grew, especially trading cities like Nuremberg, this vagueness became a problem. Markets opened and closed. Legal courts began to require time-stamped contracts. Guilds wanted to regulate labor hours. Merchants traveling across Europe needed to synchronize deals with partners far away. The demand wasn't philosophical. It was practical. How long does a task take? When will the shipment arrive? Who owes what by sundown? And so, the first great shift began not in churches or royal courts, but in workshops, where artisans tried to trap time in wheels and springs. The tinkerers of time. In 15th century Nuremberg, clockmaking emerged from a broader tradition of metalworking. The city was already renowned for its tools, armor, and scientific instruments. Skilled hands could already make compasses, astrolabes, locks, and even small automata, mechanical birds and lions that could move by turning a crank. Clockmaking grew out of this. It wasn't a sacred science or a state-funded innovation. It was the natural result of centuries of tool refinement. The earliest mechanical clocks were large, mounted in towers, driven by weights and pendulums. But by the mid-1400s, craftsmen began to experiment with spring-powered mechanisms that could be housed in small wooden or metal boxes. These were portable clocks, though they were still expensive and often inaccurate. At the center of this quiet revolution were guild-trained craftsmen, clockmakers who saw themselves not as inventors but as precise, rule-bound workers. They did not rush. They measured. They tested. They repeated. In the Zentralmarkt, Nuremberg's central market, you might find one such craftsman demonstrating a small clock to a curious crowd. It might chime every quarter hour. Its hands might move too quickly or too slowly. But the symbolism was clear. Time now lived in metal, not just in sunlight or bells. The guild system and the discipline of time. Nuremberg's clockmakers were organized under a strict guild system, a network of rules, apprenticeships, and internal justice that governed the craft. Becoming a master clockmaker wasn't just about skill. It required years of apprenticeship, an approved masterwork clock, and acceptance by the city's guild council. This system was more than regulation. It was a form of cultural control. It ensured quality, yes, but it also protected the mysteries of the craft. Clock designs were guarded secrets, often passed only through trusted apprentices. Techniques for forging tiny gears or calibrating springs were taught in whispers, not manuals. But ironically, even as clockmakers made time more precise, their own work was anything but standardized. There was no minute hand yet, and no universal time zones. Clocks varied wildly from workshop to workshop, city to city. Still, the idea of measured time began to trickle outward. Workdays began to be timed. Church bells synchronized with mechanical town clocks. Merchant contracts began referencing the third hour after dawn. In essence, the human day was beginning to break into measurable units, and with it, new expectations for labor, punctuality, and productivity. Time becomes valuable. As clocks became more widespread and slightly more affordable, they began to infiltrate not just city halls but homes, at least among the wealthier merchant class. Owning a clock was not just about utility, it was about status. A timepiece on your mantle signaled refinement, wealth, and ironically a concern for efficiency. You were someone who valued time and who could afford to control it. This created new markets. Clock cabinets carved from fine wood, custom chimes for family coats of arms, personalized dials with saints' days marked out. And it created new responsibilities. Servants were expected to rise by the clock. Workers were expected to show up at set times, not just when the sun rose. Time, once a natural rhythm, had become a commodity. And with every tick of every new gear, Europe was becoming more scheduled. The philosopher meets the craftsman. Interestingly, this mechanical shift caught the attention of European thinkers. Timekeeping became philosophical. In Nuremberg itself, mathematicians and theologians began debating the implications of precise time. If time could be divided into exact units, did that mean human life could be measured the same way? Was there a right time to pray, to work, to die? One local scholar, Johannes Müller, better known as Regiomontanus, was fascinated by the convergence of astronomy, mathematics, and mechanics. He corresponded with clockmakers, tested sundials against metal clocks, and even proposed a unified time standard based on celestial calculations. But while scholars mused, the clockmakers simply continued their work, crafting time in silence, calibrating gears while empire and theology marched on around them. They were not interested in the nature of time. They were interested in making it run on time. A clock without a crown. It's worth noting that Nuremberg's clockmakers did all this without royal patronage. They weren't part of a grand imperial project. The city was technically within the Holy Roman Empire, but it was a free imperial city, self-governed, fiercely independent, and proud of its artisan class. No king decreed the rise of clockmaking. No pope demanded it. It rose instead from demand, craft, and quiet innovation. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so remarkable. Here, in the oil-slicked fingers of ordinary craftsmen, was a revolution unfolding slowly, methodically, and with little fanfare. The impact would echo for centuries, eventually leading to standardized time zones, train schedules, factories, and even the 9-to-5 workday. But for now, it was still just a new kind of gear. A thought that ticks on. So as this section closes, think of this. Before trains, before alarms, before wristwatches and smartphones, someone in a Nuremberg workshop was shaping time one spring, one dial, one patient tick at a time. And ask yourself, when time became mechanical, did we start serving the clock? Or did it begin serving us? You return now to Nuremberg, but not to the workshops of the master clockmakers. Instead, you stand in the central marketplace, noisy, chaotic, humming with trade. The sound of the hammers in the distance is still there, but here it is joined by the chatter of merchants, the creak of carts, the snorting of pack animals. And still, quietly, time ticks forward. It is no longer just something monks pray by or astronomers chart in the stars. It's becoming the scaffold for the market itself. Time has entered commerce, and its influence is spreading minute by minute, contract by contract. Time as a merchant's tool. Nuremberg by the 16th century had become more than a city of craftsmen. It was a commercial crossroads, a major link in the growing European trade routes. Caravans arrived from Italy, from France, from the eastern cities of Poland and Bohemia. Goods came through in every direction: silks, spices, pigments, tools, iron, leather. With this trade came schedules. Traders needed predictable meeting points, reliable opening hours, coordinated agreements. The older practice of setting dates by feast days before Michaelmas, after the Ascension, was no longer precise enough. Enter the clock. For merchants, the mechanical clock offered something extraordinary, the ability to fix time in a contract. You could now say that payment would be made within the third hour after the sun's zenith, or that a shipment must arrive by the 6th hour following sunrise on the 10th day of Lent. The wording may sound strange to modern ears, but the structure was revolutionary. It marked the beginning of time as a regulated framework for economic life. The rise of the timekeeper class. With increased precision came increased expectations. Shops in Nuremberg began opening and closing by the clock. Artisans agreed to work hours within guild regulations, with disputes settled based on time logs and testimony. The idea of a working day emerged, not just a day's labor, but a day broken into parts. This development gave birth to a new sort of individual, the timekeeper. These weren't always officials. Sometimes they were hired by merchant houses. Sometimes they were servants with one job: monitor the hourglass, wind the shop clock, ring the bell at precise intervals. They became a human interface between machinery and memory. And yet their role remained informal, more trust than title. If a timekeeper lied or failed, the consequences could be costly. Missed contracts, delayed shipments, disputes between partners. So the tools improved. Some merchant houses commissioned calibrated portable timepieces, brass clocks with intricate gears and spring-powered movements that could be reset by sundials when traveling. Accuracy was still an issue, of course. Most clocks drifted by minutes per day. But even this level of regularity allowed a form of predictability, and in commerce, predictability is gold. Time and the craft guilds. At the same time, clock discipline began reshaping the internal rhythms of Nuremberg's guild economy. Before, a weaver or leatherworker might begin at dawn and stop when the light faded. Now, with clocks in the guild halls and market squares, the hours of labor were increasingly regulated. Contracts for apprentices were drawn up specifying labor expectations, from the 3rd hour after sunrise to the 9th. This had benefits. It created clearer expectations, more standardized wages, and helped prevent exploitation. But it also caused friction. Older masters, used to fluid hours and flexible rhythms, bristled at the mechanical rigidity creeping into their work. Some complained that the tyranny of the hour had replaced the honor of the craft. In one preserved petition to the Nuremberg Guild Council, circa 1517, a blacksmith wrote, "The sun does not ring bells, yet we now bend the knee to iron wheels that know not fire or frost. Must our labor end when the gear stops, even if the shoe is half-shaped?" It was a poetic complaint, but one echoed across the artisan class. The clock was no longer just a tool. It was becoming a master. Clockmakers as merchants of authority. As clocks spread, so too did the prestige of the clockmakers themselves. They were no longer just craftsmen, they became part of the city's administrative and commercial framework. Their skills were in demand not only for personal timepieces, but for public clocks, market bells, guild timers, and even city alarms. Installing a clock in a city tower or church was not just functional, it was symbolic. It declared the city's modernity, discipline, and economic ambition. Towns without clocks were seen as backward. Towns with clocks were forward-looking. The most prominent clockmakers began to travel between cities, consulting with councils, drawing up contracts, and earning commissions not unlike painters or architects. Their work was admired and heavily regulated. In Nuremberg, only registered guild members could build clocks for public use. Their designs had to be inspected and certified. The ticking of time had become, quite literally, a regulated sound. And with that, the professionalization of time deepened. The moral question of timekeeping. But not everyone celebrated this shift. Religious scholars began to worry. If time could be measured and bought and sold, did it also become profane? Could prayer be scheduled too rigidly? Could virtue be tracked like a merchant's ledger? In sermons from the early 1500s, you can find anxieties expressed about asterisk, clock time, the idea that life's moments were now being quantified rather than lived. A Dominican preacher in nearby Regensburg warned that man was given breath by God, not by gear. Beware the vanity of those who live by the chime and forget the silence. These warnings didn't stop the spread of clocks, of course, but they remind us that even in the 16th century, people were already aware of the psychological shift underway. The clock was not just a device, it was a worldview. Time in the home. In wealthier households, domestic timepieces became part of daily life, first as ornaments, then as functional guides. Meal times were regularized, prayers were scheduled, education for children began to follow set hours. Servants' workdays were no longer based on the sun or the chores to be done, but on hours counted, logged, and expected. This new sense of measured time created new forms of discipline, especially within the household. Diaries and letters from this period show growing concern with time well spent, time wasted, and the use of hours in accordance with one's station. A merchant's wife in Nuremberg wrote in 1522, "I wake with the 6th bell and take bread before the 8th. The hours move more swiftly than they did in my youth." The implication is clear. Time was beginning to feel different, not because it changed, but because people had begun to see it as something to manage. The world outside still waits. Despite all these changes, vast parts of Europe remained untouched by the ticking revolution. Peasants in the countryside continued to live by seasons and sunlight. Many villages had no clocks at all, relying on bell towers or oral cues. Travelers still had to recalibrate their timepieces by sundial or ask at city gates what the hour was. But the trend was irreversible. The merchant cities, especially those like Nuremberg, were becoming time societies, places where precision, discipline, and economic life were synchronized by metal wheels and springs. And what began as a few gears in a box was fast becoming the scaffolding of a new economic age. A thought before the bell strikes. The 15th and 16th centuries did not invent time, but they began to contain it. They began to shape human behavior around it, to make schedules, define expectations, reward punctuality, and punish delay. So, as you reflect on the spread of clocks from guild to market to home, consider: when we began measuring time, did we also begin measuring ourselves? And if so, by what standard were we ever truly on time? You return to Nuremberg one last time, not to the workshops or the market square, but to the city towers, where the mechanical hearts of public life beat steadily behind iron hands and copper dials. It is the early 16th century now. The clocks tick louder, not because they've changed, but because everyone listens more carefully. Time has become more than a tool. It has become a standard, a measure of morality, labor, and order. And as the gears continue their slow rotation, an unintended revolution has quietly taken hold. This is not the revolution of war or rebellion. It is the revolution of expectation, the idea that every hour should be counted, every moment placed on a line, every life ordered in sequence. The mechanical clock has made this possible, and the world will never be the same. From craft to command. The early generations of Nuremberg clockmakers had not set out to change society. They had only wanted to refine their craft, to master the calibration of spring, gear, and escapement. But their success created new demands, not just for clocks, but for what clocks represented: order. By 1525, nearly every significant public building in Nuremberg had a timekeeping device. Church bells, market clocks, and city hall dials were synchronized, maintained by guild-trained specialists with meticulous ledgers tracking repairs, calibrations, and hourly signals. The city ran not on decree or intuition, but on mechanical regularity. This predictability came to define the ideal citizen. A good merchant was prompt. A good apprentice showed up on time. A good household kept a clock and followed it. Even religious observance began to shift from broad spiritual rhythm to clock-bound discipline. When to rise, when to pray, when to rest, each chime carried its own subtle instruction. And with these expectations came new consequences for lateness, idleness, or deviation. It was no longer just inefficient. It was socially suspect. The discipline of the hour. The guilds, especially those in metalwork, textiles, and bookmaking, began enforcing punctuality as a matter of reputation. Arriving late could result in fines, docked pay, or loss of guild privileges. Masters recorded the hours worked by their apprentices, tracking not only their output but their presence. This marked a shift in labor ethics. Time was no longer measured only by what was made, but by how long it took. The efficiency of labor became a concern in a way it never had before. And for the workers, this shift was profound. Tasks could be mastered with experience. But now, speed mattered, precision mattered. Being able to do something was no longer enough, you had to do it at the right time. In one surviving guild dispute from 1532, a journeyman weaver argued that he had completed his work to standard. The master replied, "A cloth made late is a cloth made wrong." The weaver was fined half a day's wage not for his craft, but for his timing. The dark side of the clock. While many celebrated the order and predictability that clocks brought, others began to express unease. In poems, plays, and philosophical tracts, critiques of the tyranny of the hour began to appear. The humanist philosopher Sebastian Brandt, writing in The Ship of Fools, 1494, warned of those who trust the chime more than their conscience. He feared a world where people obeyed metal rather than morality. In popular songs, lyrics emerged mocking those chained to the gear, suggesting that those obsessed with time had lost their joy, their spontaneity, even their humanity. Even some craftsmen began to question the changes they'd helped unleash. In the notes of one Nuremberg clockmaker, dated 1544, there's a scribbled line in the margin. "Time now moves without us, but are we moved by it or emptied by it?" It's a small, quiet question, but it captures a growing feeling that something had been gained and something lost. Beyond Nuremberg, the export of time. What began in Nuremberg did not stay there. The city's clocks and its clockmakers were exported across Europe. Cities in France, Italy, and the Low Countries commissioned Nuremberg guildsmen to build and install tower clocks. Some were simple. Others were elaborate, with moving figures, knights, angels, even devils that marked the hours in theatrical displays. These clocks were more than civic pride. They were cultural announcements. We are modern, disciplined, and capable of ordering life by the hour. And with each new clock came a new rhythm for public life. Bells rang not only for worship, but for school, for curfew, for labor changeovers. Time became the architecture of the day. Even rural villages, once governed by sun and season, began to align themselves with nearby towns, listening for bells on the wind, or checking time with portable devices brought by traveling merchants. By the 17th century, portable clocks and watches would spread further still into courts, armies, and even colonies. But the heart of this change, the idea that time could be constructed, governed, and obeyed, was forged in places like Nuremberg. Clocks and the pre-industrial mindset. Though the Industrial Revolution was still 2 centuries away, the psychological groundwork was already being laid. By the mid-1500s, in cities like Nuremberg, you can see the early signs of industrial discipline. Scheduled shifts. Labor timed by the hour. Penalties for delay. Division of the day into work, rest, and prayer regulated not by need, but by bells. This was not yet a factory world, but it was a clocked world, and that mattered. Because once time could be managed, people could be managed through time. What the early guilds enforced with ledgers and bells, later factories would enforce with whistles and time cards. And it all began with a craftsman, a gear, and a chime. The fragile legacy. By the late 1500s, Nuremberg's dominance in clockmaking began to wane, challenged by newer centers like Augsburg and, later, Paris and Geneva. Yet the city's role in shaping how time was understood remained unmatched. The legacy was not in any single clock, but in the quiet, widespread shift in how people thought about daily life, responsibility, and self-measurement. Even in death, time persisted. Tombstones from this period began to include references to the hour of passing. Obituaries recorded the exact moment a person gave up the ghost. Time had entered the language of mortality. It's easy to miss how radical this was, but it marked the final, quiet victory of the clock. Time had become the measure of life itself. A final thought, the cost of precision. So as this final section winds to a close, reflect for a moment. The clockmakers of Nuremberg did not conquer lands, lead armies, or build cathedrals, but they built something subtler, the rhythm of modern life. They turned time from an experience into a structure. They made hours visible, measurable, and binding. But what did we lose when we gained the clock? Did we trade presence for punctuality, flexibility for precision? Did we build a world of productivity and forget the slow, unmeasured joys that once filled unbroken afternoons? And most hauntingly, if the clock taught us to count our hours, who taught us how to spend them? Story 4. The Salt Roads of Languedoc, France's Gay Belle and the Burden of Brine. You're walking now through the dry, sun-bleached paths of Languedoc in southern France, sometime in the early 17th century. The air is heavy with dust, and in the distance, salt pans shimmer under the Mediterranean sun. You see peasants with baskets, their feet crusted white with salt. Donkeys groan under heavy sacks. No armies march here. No kings reside here. And yet this region is caught in one of the longest, most quietly oppressive systems in French history. The Gay Belle attacks not on land, not on gold, but on salt. To understand the Gay Belle is to understand how a kingdom can balance itself on a mineral, and how that balance can slowly crush the people who bear its weight. Salt as survival. Salt is not optional. In a pre-industrial society, salt preserved food, cured meat, cleaned wounds, and balanced the body. For the poor in rural France, salt was a daily necessity, not a seasoning. It was how you kept meat through winter, how you ensured your family didn't fall ill, how you traded for bread or labor in seasons of scarcity. But in the Kingdom of France, salt was also something else. It was a revenue stream. Beginning in the 14th century and stretching into the late 18th, the French monarchy imposed the Gay Belle, a complex and regionally uneven tax on salt. It varied wildly by province. Some regions, such as Brittany, were exempt entirely. Others, like Languedoc, were oppressively taxed, forced to purchase minimum quantities of salt at state-run warehouses, regardless of their needs. This wasn't a suggestion, it was law. Every person over the age of 8 was required to buy a certain amount of salt per year from the royal distributor, even if they couldn't afford it, even if they had no use for it, even if salt could be obtained cheaper nearby. And so, salt, this humble, vital mineral, became a symbol of injustice. The royal salt monopoly. The logic behind the Gay Belle was, as always, bureaucratic. France's monarchy needed revenue. War, debt, and courtly extravagance demanded a steady flow of funds. Rather than tax the nobility whose privileges were protected, the crown focused on the third estate, the commoners. Salt was an ideal target. It was used by everyone. It couldn't easily be substituted, and it could be controlled, produced in government-supervised pans and stored in royal warehouses or greniers à sel. To enforce this monopoly, the French state did not merely collect a tax. It created an entire infrastructure. Salt was stored only in official warehouses. It could only be bought from designated sellers. Possessing untaxed salt or selling salt from another province was a criminal act, punishable by prison, confiscation of property, or even death. And in Languedoc, where salt flowed freely from the marshes and had been a communal resource for centuries, this was nothing short of an insult. The burden of Languedoc. Languedoc was classified as a pays de Grand Gabelle, a region subject to the harshest form of the salt tax. This meant mandatory purchase of salt, fixed annual quotas per household, inflated prices up to 10 times higher than in salt-exempt regions. Worse still, Languedoc was surrounded by regions with different rules. In some neighboring provinces, salt was cheaper. In others, the tax was not enforced. The result, a thriving and dangerous underground economy, smuggling. Salt runners, known as fauconniers, crisscrossed the countryside under cover of darkness. They moved salt by mule, in wagons, or sewn into the hems of coats. They bribed guards, forged documents, and maintained hidden caches beneath floorboards and behind church altars. This was not glamorous criminality. These were often desperate farmers, trying to survive a system that demanded they buy what they could not afford and punished them when they tried to resist. Royal troops were dispatched to patrol the roads, search homes, and monitor river crossings. Arrests were frequent. Jails in Languedoc filled with men, women, and even children accused of salt crimes. In a society already fragmented by privilege, the Gabelle was a constant, grinding reminder. You were not equal under the law. The greniers à sel. At the center of the Gabelle system stood the salt warehouses, massive depots that served as distribution points and symbols of state power. Each granary had a staff of clerks, guards, and tax inspectors. Farmers were required to travel to these buildings, often miles away, to purchase their mandatory salt allotment. They paid not just for the salt, but for the privilege of transporting it themselves. Granaries were heavily guarded. Inventories were tracked to the grain. Officials made regular inspections. Sometimes the salt was clumped, spoiled, or mixed with impurities, but it didn't matter. You still had to buy it. Corruption was common. Warehouse keepers sometimes undermeasured salt, sold expired product, or demanded bribes to avoid late penalties. Complaints were filed but rarely answered. And yet, for all its cruelty, the Gabelle was effective. It brought in millions of livres for the crown each year. It helped finance royal armies and maintain palaces. In a sense, the white crust on the backs of peasants carried the grandeur of Versailles. Resistance begins in whispers. And still, people resisted. In Languedoc, entire villages collaborated to hide smuggled salt. Local priests would warn of inspections from the pulpit. Children were trained to recognize royal patrols and deliver warnings. In some towns, women formed salt-buying cooperatives, purchasing the minimum legal allotment and redistributing it informally. Court records show a quiet rebellion, not in slogans but in silence and solidarity. Villagers refused to testify against neighbors. Juries nullified salt smuggling charges. In some towns, entire juries were made up of fauconniers themselves, appointed to ensure leniency. This was not the storming of a Bastille. It was a rebellion of delayed purchases, broken quotas, and missing records. In 1643, a tax commissioner visiting Languedoc wrote, "The people do not rise in arms, but their salt disappears. Their mouths are closed. Their eyes do not look upon the warehouse. I find no words, only silence." It was the silence of survival and of simmering rage. A system that couldn't bend. What made the Gabelle so hated was not just its cost, it was its inflexibility. The salt tax did not respond to bad harvests, local famine, or regional needs. In years of drought, when livestock died and families went hungry, the salt quota remained. In years of war or plague, when villages were half empty, the warehouse still waited with its ledgers open. There was no appeal, no mercy. And so the gay bell became a curse woven into daily life. It didn't explode into rebellion immediately, but it lingered in every conversation, every journey, every empty purse. And the people of Languedoc, for all their obedience, never forgot that they were being punished for needing salt. A question carried on the wind. As the sun sets over the salt marshes, and another cart creaks toward the granary, consider this. What happens when a government taxes something you can't live without? And what happens when people, year after year, simply stop believing that law is the same as justice? You return to Languedoc, but now at night. The sun has dipped behind the hills, and what the tacksman of Paris cannot see has become its own small world. In a forest clearing, a donkey's hooves softly tap over dried pine needles. Its cargo, salt stitched into flour sacks, hidden in wine barrels, laced into the stitching of cloaks. This is not a romantic smuggler's tale, not a legend of outlaws and rebels with grand speeches. It is a grinding, rural truth. In the south of France, during the reigns of Louis XIII and Louis XIV, thousands of ordinary people became salt criminals, their lives turned by the gay bell from farmers into lawbreakers. This section follows them. The smugglers, the local magistrates, the collaborators, and the resistors, and the vast, slow, bureaucratic machine sent to control them. Salt smuggling, a profession born of poverty. By the 17th century, salt smuggling in Languedoc was no longer a rare act of desperation. It had become a regional economy. Entire families were involved. Men carried the salt, women distributed it, children watched the roads. Villages near the provincial borders became salt depots, hubs where untaxed salt from low-tax provinces like Guyenne or Provence could be repackaged and moved inland. In the forests and mountain passes, known smuggling trails were carved into the land, passed down like family secrets. They had names: La Route du Sel Noir, the Black Salt Road; La Piste des Muets, the Path of the Mute, names that hinted at silence, secrecy, and shame. Smugglers were rarely rich. Most earned barely more than subsistence, just enough to keep themselves out of the granaries. But they were doing more than earning, they were resisting a system that refused to hear them. And though they carried salt, what they trafficked more deeply was agency, the ability to say no, however quietly, to a system that demanded obedience. The Fauconniers' trial. Consider the case of Jacques Morin, a peasant from the Tarn Valley arrested in 1669 for salt smuggling. The record survives in faded ink on thin parchment, held today in the archives départementales of Toulouse. His crime: being found in possession of 4 pounds of untaxed salt, hidden in a hollowed-out ox yoke. His trial lasted 2 weeks, witnesses were called, neighbors were questioned, a local priest vouched for his honesty. Morin claimed the salt was for his sick mother. The court found him guilty. His sentence: 5 years in the galleys, chained to an oar aboard a French warship, rowing until he died or was released. Such punishments were not exceptional. By the 1700s, over 10,000 people had been condemned to the galleys for violations of the gay bell. The gay bell, it seems, was not just a tax, it was a machine of fear, justice, and resistance in the village courts. But not all magistrates enforced it so zealously. In Languedoc, where magistrates often came from the same class and even the same villages as the accused, justice took on an ambiguous tone. Court records show repeated nullifications, delays, and selective leniency. In some cases, entire panels of judges returned verdicts of no offense committed, even when evidence was overwhelming. In others, fines were lowered, time served was reduced, or investigations were indefinitely postponed. One judge in Montpellier, writing in a private letter in 1683, put it bluntly: If I punish every soul for salt, I will empty my city and fill my prison. And what then will remain for the king to rule? There was, even among the enforcers, a growing recognition that something was breaking down, that a law too rigid can become a fault line beneath the feet of a state. The role of women in the salt underground. Though most records emphasize male smugglers, women played a central, invisible role in resisting the gay bell. They were the distributors, the informants, and often the transporters of small, concealed quantities of salt. Women carried salt in false-bottomed baskets, under skirts, or sewn into baby clothes. In market towns, they coordinated collective purchases from smugglers and quietly resold the salt by the ounce. They warned neighbors when inspections were coming. In some cases, they took the blame when their husbands were caught. And yet, women were rarely prosecuted as harshly. The state considered them less threatening, less central to the criminal network. This underestimation allowed women to operate beneath the notice of Parisian authorities, even as they held entire communities together through their quiet resistance. In the town of Béziers, records show that salt smuggling was prosecuted primarily as a male crime despite estimates from later historians that women were responsible for up to 40% of illegal salt circulation. It was, in a sense, a war the monarchy never saw clearly. Royal responses, a machine that tightens. The French crown, aware of widespread smuggling but unwilling to abandon the gay bell, responded not with reform but with expansion. By the late 1600s, salt patrols had been formalized into mobile brigades of armed inspectors. Known as les archers du sel, these agents were given wide authority to search homes without warrants, seize property, and arrest suspects on suspicion alone. Granaries were fortified, roadblocks were set up, rewards were offered for informants. And in 1680, a new law was passed. Children over 12 could be tried for salt crimes as adults. But the smuggling didn't stop, it adapted. Trails became more secret, disguises more elaborate, communities more tight-lipped. The gay bell, like all brittle systems, began to show cracks. It remained in force, but it could no longer command respect. It could only enforce fear. A system designed to divide. The gay bell did something else too. It divided France. Some regions like Brittany, Provence, and parts of the Pyrenees were exempt from the salt tax altogether. These pays-exempts paid a lump sum to the crown and were left alone. In contrast, pays de grand gay bell like Languedoc suffered the full weight of enforcement. The result was a kingdom of salt inequality. People born a few kilometers apart lived under entirely different systems of law and taxation. This regional imbalance would later fuel broader political unrest. When the revolution came, it wasn't just about liberty or equality. It was also about who had paid and who hadn't. The gay bell wasn't forgotten. It was remembered bitterly as a system that measured citizens not by their loyalty or labor, but by their postal code. A thought left in salt. So as this section ends, and the trail of the salt mule disappears into the trees, consider what it means to live under a law you do not believe in but must obey anyway. And ask, is it still law? If everyone knows it's wrong. You return to Languedoc one final time, just decades before the walls of the Bastille will fall. But here, in the quiet southern fields and worn village streets, revolution doesn't feel like thunder. It feels like salt stains on worn hands, empty granaries, and the quiet click of a door being locked against another salt patrol. The gay bell still exists, now more hated than ever, enforced more harshly and defended by a state too rigid to reform. But something has changed. The silence has turned heavy. Resignation is hardening into rage. This section explores the final decades of the gay bell, its cruel persistence, its role in eroding trust in the monarchy, and how this small, granular injustice helped ferment one of the greatest upheavals in European history. The Gabelle in the Age of Absolutism. By the 18th century, the Gabelle had grown into one of the most complex and regressive tax systems in Europe. It was not uniform, not fair, and not effective, at least not by the standards of justice. Yet the French monarchy clung to it with obsessive determination. Why? Because it worked for them. In a kingdom where the nobility and clergy were largely exempt from taxation, the Gabelle provided a guaranteed income from the poor. It was deeply embedded in the financial structure of the ancient regime. Salt warehouses still functioned in Languedoc. People still had to buy their quota, regardless of need or affordability. Punishments for smuggling had become even more severe. In 1760, a man in Carcassonne was publicly flogged and branded with an S for illegally trading 4 pounds of salt. And the people, they obeyed, they grumbled, but they remembered. Tension in the grain and the brine. While salt was taxed, grain prices were rising. Failed harvests in the 1760s and 1770s brought famine and unrest across the countryside. People who couldn't afford bread also couldn't afford their state-mandated salt. This created a cruel paradox. You could starve and still be jailed for failing to buy salt. Villages across Languedoc began to suffer waves of petty criminalization. Families already on the brink were fined for salt violations. Some sold personal possessions, tools, cookware, even marriage dowries to pay salt quotas and avoid prison. In the archives of Nimes, a 1772 petition survives from a widow named Marie de Risseroux. She begged the regional intendant to waive her salt obligation after her husband and 3 children had died of fever. She explained that she lived alone, owned no animals, and had no use for the salt. The petition was denied. These are not dramatic tales. There were no barricades, but they reveal something more corrosive, a population that no longer believed the law was made for them. The tally of injustice. Historians now estimate that at its height, the Gabelle accounted for up to 10% of royal revenue, yet it disproportionately punished the poorest. By 1780, over 3,000 people per year were being imprisoned in France for salt-related crimes. The Fermiers Gaynerocs, private tax collectors contracted by the crown, became the most hated figures in French civil life. These men grew wealthy, enforcing the Gabelle, living in opulent estates while their victims went to the galleys. Smuggling, once a quiet survival tactic, began to take on a more political tone. Pamphlets circulated anonymously. Tracts denounced the injustice of taxing God's mineral. A salt smuggler caught near Toulouse reportedly told his captors in 1785, "If the king wants to weigh every tear, let him start with mine." And in taverns, in parish halls, in back rooms of rural inns, talk turned from complaint to conspiracy. Languedoc in the revolutionary imagination. When the Estates General was called in 1789, the cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances, submitted by citizens, were flooded with references to the Gabelle. Villagers in Languedoc wrote plainly, "Let the salt tax be ended, and the people shall need no further encouragement to love their country." Another cahier declared, "We are not beasts to be salted by decree." These weren't just economic complaints, they were moral accusations. The Gabelle had become a symbol of everything wrong with the ancient regime: inequality, cruelty, indifference, and absurd bureaucracy. And when revolution finally came, the Gabelle was among the first casualties. The fall of the Gabelle. In March 1790, less than a year after the storming of the Bastille, the National Assembly voted to abolish the Gabelle. There were debates, of course. Some argued the crown couldn't afford to lose the revenue, but the public hatred of the tax was too strong. The people demanded its end not just as a financial reform, but as a moral reckoning. Celebrations broke out in the South. In Languedoc, people held mock funerals for salt barrels. In Montpellier, a group of former smugglers marched openly through the streets, carrying sacks of salt and singing. A salt merchant from Narbonne was quoted as saying, "At last, we may season our lives without shame." But the joy was tempered by memory. The scars, physical and psychological, left by the gay bell would not disappear overnight. Aftermath and reflection. The end of the gay bell did not end poverty, nor did it bring immediate justice. France's revolution brought chaos, bloodshed, and new forms of control. But something had shifted. For centuries, people had endured salt as a tool of oppression. Its necessity had made it the perfect instrument for exploitation. Yet in the end, that very necessity also made it a rallying point for resistance. The gay bell taught people that a government could be resisted, that law could be unjust, and that attacks on survival could become a spark for revolution. Final thought: what remains? Today, the salt marshes of Languedoc remain. Some are still harvested, though now for gourmet use or export. The old granaries are museums, their stone walls filled with quiet displays and faded documents. But no one stands guard at the doors. No one counts your salt. No one forces you to buy. Still, one cannot help but wonder. If something as small as salt could break the trust between a people and their king, what else even now might be quietly doing the same? Story 5. The Quiet Fall of the Hanseatic League. The air is sharp with sea salt and the creak of timber. You're standing on a pier in Lubeck, sometime in the late 15th century. The city is busy but not bustling. Sails flap like laundry in the wind. Barrels of fish, grain, and wax are being loaded onto flat-bottomed cogs. Men argue over weights, tariffs, and the timing of the tides. There are no royal guards here, no glittering courts. Yet this city, one of dozens like it strung across the cold edges of northern Europe, belongs to what was once called a merchant empire without an emperor, the Hanseatic League. You may not know its name well, but for centuries, the League was one of the most powerful commercial alliances in Europe. It had no standing army, no crown, and no formal borders. But it had ships, trade laws, and the power to embargo kings. Now, however, something is changing, not with a crash, but with a long, slow, bureaucratic fade. The Hanseatic League is not falling. It is unraveling, contract by contract, port by port, ship by ship. And no one seems to be able to stop it. What was the Hanseatic League? The Hanseatic League was not a country, not an empire, and not a traditional alliance. It was a loose confederation of northern European towns and cities stretching from Bruges to Bergen, from Lubeck to Novgorod, who banded together to control trade across the Baltic and North Seas. At its peak in the 14th century, over 200 towns belonged to the League. They traded in fish, salt, timber, furs, cloth, wax, and grain. They established trade outposts called contours in major ports like London, Bergen, and Novgorod, protected by their own laws and diplomatic privileges. And they did all of this without kings. The League's power came from economic unity. Cities acted in concert to protect merchants, regulate prices, and enforce embargoes. If one member city was attacked, the others could boycott the aggressor. They negotiated treaties, standardized weights and measures, and even coordinated naval defense. But the League's strength was also its fragility. It depended entirely on the consensus of its member cities, and consensus is a difficult thing to maintain when profits begin to diverge. Lubeck, Queen of the Hands. If there was a capital of the Hanseatic League, it was Lubeck, the Queen of the Hands, a city of narrow streets, brick warehouses, and cold discipline. In the 15th century, Lubeck administered the League's diets, meetings of delegates from member cities. These weren't grand, festive congresses. They were tedious affairs filled with arguments over tolls, piracy, river access, and dock rights. The League had no standing army, no coercive power. If a member city refused to enforce a decision, there was little recourse. Compliance was voluntary. enforced mostly through peer pressure and the threat of economic retaliation. But the merchants of Lubeck still believed in the League. They maintained meticulous records, preserved trade agreements with wax seals, and sent envoys across northern Europe to defend Hanseatic privileges. Their world was one of ledgers and parchment, where power moved not in armies, but in paper and patience. And yet, even here in Lubeck, a creeping sense of decline was setting in. The cracks in the ice. By the late 15th century, several forces had begun to weaken the League from within. 1. Rising nation-states. England, France, Denmark, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were centralizing power. They no longer wanted independent merchant enclaves within their borders. The Hanseatic contours in London and Bruges faced increasing restrictions, taxation, and even expulsion. 2. Technological chain. New ships larger, faster, more versatile than the traditional Hanseatic cog were being built in Spain and the Netherlands. These vessels could handle ocean voyages, opening up Atlantic trade routes that bypassed the Hanseatic heartlands entirely. 3. Internal division. Not all Hanseatic cities benefited equally from trade. The larger cities Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen dominated decision-making. Smaller towns resented this imbalance. Many began pursuing their own interests, signing treaties and setting tariffs without League approval. The League's strength had always been its unity, and that unity was now cracking not with rebellion, but with shrugs and silences. The death of Novgorod. One of the most symbolic blows came in 1494, when Ivan III of Russia closed the Hanseatic contour in Novgorod. For centuries, Novgorod had been the League's eastern anchor, a vital hub for the fur and wax trade. It had operated under Hanseatic privilege, governed by German law, and maintained its own warehouses and churches. But Ivan III, intent on centralizing Russian authority, ordered the expulsion of the Hanseatic merchants. Their goods were confiscated, their warehouses sealed. The contour was dissolved. Lübeck protested, letters were sent, appeals were made to kings and popes. But nothing came of it. The League had no army to retaliate, no ships that could threaten Russian ports. The city of Novgorod remained, but the Hanseatic flag no longer flew there. And in Lübeck's archives, another red line was drawn through a ledger, one more trade route lost. The London contour, silent decay. Another wound came from London. For generations, the Hanseatic contour at Steelyard, a walled enclave on the Thames, had been the center of German trade in England. But by the early 16th century, tensions were rising. English merchants, jealous of Hanseatic privileges, lobbied the crown to limit foreign traders. In 1598, Queen Elizabeth I finally closed the Steelyard contour. It was not sacked, no riots occurred, but the gate was locked, the halls were shuttered. The Hanseatic chapter in London ended with quiet legality, a termination by signature. It was another death, not with a bang, but a quill, holding onto dust. Despite these losses, the League limped on into the 16th and 17th centuries. Diets continued to meet. Treaties were still negotiated. Some cities clung to the Hanseatic name out of habit, nostalgia, or the faint hope of revival. But increasingly, the League became a formality, a framework remembered rather than used. Trade still occurred, but it was no longer coordinated. Each city acted in its own interest. The great blockades of earlier centuries, the united merchant embargoes that once brought kings to the table, were now unthinkable. A Danish merchant writing in 1607 remarked, "The Han cities speak often, but their ships sail alone." The League had become a story its members told themselves, a shared fiction of strength that no longer held sway in the real world. Final echoes. By the mid-17th century, the League was effectively defunct. Only a handful of cities, chiefly Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, continued to invoke its name. Even they no longer coordinated trade in any meaningful way. The last formal diet was held in 1669. No major resolutions were passed. No efforts at revival were made. The League was not abolished. It was simply not continued. In a final irony, the League so meticulously documented left no official declaration of death. It faded the way old habits do, with no funeral, only forgetfulness. A thought carried on cold water. So as the tide pulls at the old mooring posts in Lübeck's harbor, and the merchant ships now fly the flags of nations instead of cities, consider this. What does it mean for a system to end not in fire or revolution, but in silence? Is it still a fall if no one watches it happen? Story 6. Taverns and Timber, Life in a Swedish Forest Hamlet. You wake up to the creak of wood and the smell of smoke. Not the sharp smoke of war or fire, but the slow, earthy breath of a forest hearth, where spruce logs have been burning since before dawn. This is Sweden, sometime in the mid-17th century, but not the Sweden of kings, battle flags, or great Protestant alliances. This is deep Sweden inland, rural and wrapped in pine. You're in a forest hamlet near Värmland or Dalarna, not far from the Norwegian border. There is no castle here, no university, no paved road. Just cabins made of thick logs, small clearings for rye, and a narrow path worn smooth by hooves and feet, leading toward a solitary building with a sagging sign carved with a crude picture of a mug. This is the village tavern. And this, more than the crown, the church, or even the family, is where the real record of rural life is written. In every cup poured and every silence shared beside the hearth, you find a different kind of history, the boring, vital kind, the kind that tells you how people actually survived. A kingdom of trees. Sweden in the 17th century was a rising power. Under kings like Gustavus Adolphus and Charles X. Gustav, Sweden expanded into northern Germany, Finland, and parts of Poland and the Baltics. On paper, it was an empire. But that empire was built not just on armies, but on wood. Forests covered over 75% of Sweden's land, and though iron and copper would become key exports, it was timber, especially tar-soaked pine for shipbuilding, that formed the backbone of rural labor. The Swedish Navy, merchant ships, and even English and Dutch fleets relied on Scandinavian timber to stay afloat. In hamlets like this one, everyone worked with wood. Men felled trees, trimmed logs, and floated them downstream. Women and children gathered bark for tanning or wove birch roots into baskets. Entire families spent winters producing pitch and tar, used to seal ships from the North Sea's rot and brine. Yet these hamlets were far from the markets they supplied. Payment was irregular. Coinage was rare. Most people lived on a mix of barter, credit, and state obligation. So when snow thickened the forest paths and no more carts could pass, the tavern became the ledger of labor, news, marriage, and survival. The forest tavern, more than a drink. In today's imagination, the word tavern might conjure scenes of boisterous songs and overflowing steins. But here, deep in the woods of Värmland, the tavern is more like a community hall with a hearth and weak ale. It is usually a longhouse built of thick pine logs, one half devoted to benches and tables, the other to storage and brewing. The keeper is often a widow or an older man exempt from timber duty. In the corner, a vat bubbles brewing small beer, a low-alcohol beverage safer than water, or occasionally schnapps, depending on the season. By law, taverns were the only places peasants were permitted to sell alcohol, and they also served as rest stations for crown officials, tax agents, and traveling clergy. But mostly, the tavern served as the pulse of the village. Here, neighbors traded stories of wolves seen near the stream. They debated rumors of wars far away. They borrowed tools and settled disputes. Here, logs of barter were remembered, not written. Someone owed someone else a coat. A piglet had been promised last spring. A broken sled needed fixing before the melt. And when a child died or a soldier returned home lame, or a marriage was arranged, it was here, by the slow-burning hearth, that these facts were acknowledged and folded into the fabric of daily life. A calendar of chores. Life in the hamlet followed the forest's clock. Winter was for carving, repairing, and brewing. Logs were hauled over snow-packed roads to staging points by frozen rivers. Spring was for planting rye, cleaning soot-blackened chimneys, and beginning the first timber cuts. Summer was shortest, marked by foraging, haying, and binding bundles of brushwood for winter fuel. Autumn brought the return of men from distant jobs, seasonal laborers who'd been cutting trees deeper in the interior or working near the coast, now back with whatever goods or news they'd carried home. But the calendar was also social. St. Eric's Day meant a small festival and shared beer. Midsummer brought song, dance, and perhaps a new baby 9 months later. The King's Tax Day arrived with boots at the tavern door and the scraping of copper coin across wood. In a world where almost no one could read, this cycle of seasonal labor, tavern gossip, and ritual observance became a kind of oral archive. You learned who you were by what others remembered about you at the tavern. Women in the woodlands. Women in these hamlets carried as much responsibility as men, though rarely in the same jobs. While men handled felling and floating logs, women did nearly everything else. Brewing, spinning, planting, milking. Raising children, preserving food, tending sick neighbors. Managing accounts in memory, especially when husbands were away for weeks at a time. In many hamlets, it was women who operated the taverns. Officially licensed or not, they kept the beer flowing, tracked informal debts, and ensured strangers were fed and watched. They also mediated disputes not as judges, but as witnesses. Their knowledge of who owed what, who married whom, and who had failed to pay back a borrowed goat was priceless. In letters written by traveling Lutheran priests, one finds grudging respect for the widow keepers of taverns who held more sway than any bailiff. Their power was subtle, but in places where courts were days away and kings were even further, subtle power was the only kind that mattered. The church and the crown, in theory. Technically, the hamlet was part of the Swedish crown. Taxes were due. Military service could be demanded. Children were baptized and confirmed by the church. But in practice, state presence was thin. A traveling priest might visit once a season. A tax collector might appear twice a year, sometimes with soldiers, sometimes not. Royal edicts were posted at the tavern door, but few could read them. And so, royal power was less about law and more about rhythm. You paid what you were told to pay. You made space when the crown needed wood. You didn't argue, but you also didn't see the crown as a daily authority. It was distant, dismissive, mostly uninterested. The real authority lived in shared memory, mutual obligation, and the tavern table where everyone knew who was kind, who was stingy, and who had been born during the last frost. An unspoken survival pact. When bad winters came, and they often did, survival depended on what couldn't be recorded. If someone's cow died in a snowstorm, neighbors shared milk. If a boy fell through the ice, a fisherman gave up his spare net. If a mother went into labor alone, a tavern keeper's daughter was sent to assist. There was no official welfare. There was no central authority to appeal to, but there was a communal understanding, passed from one tavern bench to another. You will not last here alone. And so people gave, not always kindly, not always fairly, but enough. And when the snow thawed and the roads reopened, it was in the tavern that people tallied the debts spoken and unspoken and started again. A question in the steam. As steam rises from a cracked wooden mug, and the tavern fills with quiet talk and the sound of rain on the roof, ask yourself, what holds a community together when the king is far away, the road is frozen, and survival depends not on laws but on who remembers your name by the fire. The snow has melted, and the pines are weeping sap into the warming air. It's spring now in the Swedish forest hamlet. The quiet, frost-bitten world of winter has given way to something more urgent: labor. Children chase chickens across muddy paths. Women sort last year's rye in the lean-to granary, checking for mold. And men, those still here, are sharpening axes, repairing sledges, and tightening the pitch barrels for the long months ahead. It's time to go into the woods. This is the season of timber and tar. And though there is no fanfare, no central planner, and few coins exchanged, the work about to be done here by ordinary people in wool and leather will fuel the military and economic ambitions of the Swedish Empire. Because the road to Stockholm and to war runs through the forest hamlet, carried on the backs of timber sleds and the fumes of burning pitch. The business of pine. Sweden's forests, especially in the inland provinces, were a nearly inexhaustible source of pine and spruce. But the trees weren't just valuable for their trunks. The real gold was in what came from their heart's tar. Tar, made by slow-burning pine roots and stumps in low-oxygen pits, was essential for sealing ships. It kept hulls watertight, protected ropes, preserved wood, and staved off rot and barnacles. Every naval power in Europe needed it, and Sweden, thanks to hamlets like this, produced it by the ton. A single large navy might use over 100 barrels of tar per season. And as Sweden fought war after war with Denmark, Russia, and Poland, demand only grew. So in this village, as the days lengthened, the tar pits were prepared. The tar kiln, controlled fire, generational knowledge. The tar kiln, called a tejedel, was a shallow, conical pit dug into a slope. It was lined with clay, packed with pine roots and resinous stumps, and carefully covered with turf to restrict oxygen. When lit, it smoldered for days, slowly oozing thick, dark tar down a channel into a waiting barrel. Making tar was both simple and dangerous. Too much air and the pit would catch fire. Too little and the pitch would go sour. There were no thermometers. Everything depended on experience: the smell of the smoke, the sound of sap boiling, the feel of heat against the palm. Boys learned by watching. Grandfathers adjusted the turf. Women collected twigs to patch air leaks. The tar pit was not owned by any one person, but used by the village collectively, its output divided according to labor and need. And once the barrels were sealed, they were dragged by ox cart or floated down narrow rivers toward shipping points closer to the coast, perhaps to Gävle, or farther on to Stockholm. The tar never stayed, but its smoke curled through the village all summer. A trade without coin. In a world with little cash, tar became currency. A well-made tar barrel could be traded for a pair of good boots, 2 sacks of rye, a set of iron nails, a half-year's tax obligation. The crown itself accepted tar in lieu of coin, knowing that the military would need it. Local bailiffs kept records not only of silver payments, but also of natural goods: timber, tar, iron, pigs, hides. This created a strange economy where value was fluid. A bad season for tar might mean debts remained unpaid. A good one might allow a farmer to marry off a daughter with a proper dowry. And in the tavern, these trades were negotiated over hours and cups of thin ale, not in banks. It was an economy of trust, of memory, and of substance. Crown oversight, distant yet present. Technically, all this labor was done under the watchful eye of the Swedish state. The crown, increasingly organized in the 17th century, sent inspectors and royal buyers into the provinces to assess timber stands, tax tar, and requisition ship supplies. But these men rarely stayed long. They passed through, took their quotas, issued receipts, often unread by those who received them, and rode on. To many villagers, the crown was a seasonal presence like the frost or the flax bloom. It came, it made demands, it left. Sometimes it brought punishment: arrests for hoarding tar, punishments for underreporting timber. But just as often, it simply arrived, gave orders, and disappeared, leaving the burden of compliance on village elders and tavern keepers who were expected to make it right. And so, once again, the tavern became the place where taxes were tallied, debts adjusted, and records oral or otherwise reconciled. Summer labor, shared and stratified. The busiest weeks came in midsummer, when the weather allowed for long days of work and transport. Whole families would move into the deeper forest, setting up temporary camps near cutting sites. These huts were basic woven branches, tarpaulin, dirt floors, but they allowed work to continue without returning to the village each night. Men felled trees and split logs. Women cooked, wove birch ropes, and kept fires burning. Older children hauled water, gathered branches, or guarded oxen. The youngest were left with neighbors or brought along strapped to a mother back. There were no days off except Sunday. But the labor wasn't constant misery. Even in hard work there was music, companionship, and ritual. Songs were sung in rhythm with the saw. Jokes were traded over pine-smoked stews. And when a large tree fell well, people cheered. These were not serfs. They were free peasants, proud of their labor, bound more by tradition than law. Yet even in this solidarity, hierarchies remained. The best timber cutters commanded respect. Those with draft animals were more powerful than those without. Widows or the infirm depended on others, and often paid with favors, labor, or reputation rather than goods. The system worked, but just barely. What the empire took. All of this labor, cutting, burning, hauling, rarely enriched the villagers. They survived, yes. Some years brought modest comfort, but few ever saw the coins or luxuries that passed through Stockholm's ports. The wood built ships, the tar sealed hulls, the timber framed churches, armories, and manors far away. But back here in the forest, the houses remained simple. The diet stayed plain. The hands stayed calloused. The hamlet's contribution to the empire was invisible, unless you knew where to look. In the scars on old tree stumps, in the grooves worn into forest roads, in the stories told over and over by firelight. The crown rarely thanked them, but it depended on them utterly. A thought at the tree line. As you walk back through the forest, tar smoke curling behind you and pine needles crunching underfoot, ask yourself, what does it mean to build an empire from the edge? To be the hand that fells the tree, but never holds the sail. The summer is fatting now. The tar barrels are sealed and gone, the last logs have floated downstream, and the air carries that familiar bite, the early whisper of frost. Life in the Swedish forest hamlet is returning to its autumn rhythm, quieter, slower, more introspective. The forest is still green, but everything is winding down. Ropes are coiled, carts are mended, chimneys are cleared, and the tavern once again becomes the center of things. Here in the final stretch of the year, we begin to see what all the work was really for. Not profit, not progress, but continuity. A system where survival is neither dramatic nor dire, but deliberate, maintained through habit, compromise, and the remembering of countless small things. This final section looks at what made this dull rhythm sustainable and how, despite being unremarkable in the eyes of the empire, it endured. The account book without ink. There is no official record of most forest hamlet life in the 1600s. There are no detailed journals, no peasant memoirs, no ledgers carefully passed down through generations. And yet, everything was recorded not in books but in people. Memory was the bank, the tavern was the archive. Every favor, every loan, every insult, and every promise was stored in the minds of those who heard it and repeated it. And because winters were long and communities small, forgetting wasn't easy. If a man borrowed a sled and returned it damaged, that story lived. If a woman gave food to a sick neighbor in spring, that kindness might return to her in the form of a shared piglet come fall. These transactions were not sentimental, they were economic, emotional, social, survival-based. The system relied on a mutual, enforced remembering. The tavern helped. Every gathering was a moment of review where debts could be repaid, mistakes acknowledged, and gossip refreshed. In a village with no paper economy, this system, dull, slow, imprecise, was more reliable than distant laws or forgotten taxes. Winter, the great equalizer. When winter returned, as it always did, the hamlet entered its most fragile phase. Supplies were tallied, bread was rationed, beer was brewed in weak batches, children were kept indoors, wolves were heard at the edge of the forest, illness crept in coughs, fevers, stillbirths. But there was no panic, because winter was expected. It was managed the way everything else was, through shared burdens. Families that had stored extra firewood gave to those who hadn't. A broken sled might be repaired by 3 neighbors, each contributing 1 nail. A widow might be brought a basket of oats once a week, quietly, without discussion. This wasn't charity, it was continuity insurance. You helped others this year because next year it might be your child who needed boots. The tavern again played its part, gathering people into warmth, allowing for planning, adjustment, recalibration. Even in deep snow, someone would trudge the path to check if the ale was still warm, if the keeper had heard news, if anyone was missing. The return of the crown. Once or twice in the winter, a royal official might appear, often with guards, sometimes alone. He would check grain stores, demand taxes, inspect the village for signs of evasion or sedition. But the official stayed only as long as necessary. Roads were dangerous, the snow was deep, and the villagers were respectful but unhelpful. Information was vague. Memory conveniently failed. He would leave with a list of names, a handful of frozen root vegetables, and a few curses muttered as he disappeared down the road. The hamlet would then gather at the tavern and recount his visit, every word, every gesture catalogued, not with fear, but with a kind of dry amusement. Same boots as last year, someone would say. Worse manners, another would add. And then someone would pour a weak cup of beer, and the subject would shift to the weather. The children, carriers of quiet knowledge. Children in these hamlets were rarely taught to read, but they were taught to remember. By the time they reached adolescence, they knew how to light a fire in rain, which mushrooms to avoid, who was related to whom, and what debts were owed between families, which paths were safe after snow, and which wolves had claimed which part of the forest. They learned not by instruction, but by absorption. Every trip to the tavern, every whispered story at the hearth, every chore assigned had layers of meaning beneath it. By the time they came of age, they were not just workers. They were bearers of knowledge, timelines of history stored not in ink, but in intuition. And when a parent died, or a neighbor fell ill, or a stranger arrived with a shiny coin and too many questions, it was often the children who knew what was really going on. Life without legacy. Few of these villagers dreamed of changing their lives. Upward mobility was not expected. Travel was rare, and ambition in the modern sense was regarded with suspicion. What mattered was durability. Was your roof still intact? Did your sled still run? Could your daughter inherit your cow? Would someone remember to bring firewood when your back gave out? The goal was not to rise, it was to stay in place without falling. This was not despair, it was strategy. Because in a world ruled by weather, war, and kings who never visited, the most radical thing a forest peasant could do was outlast the system quietly, without drawing attention, without losing the thread of survival, and without forgetting who owed whom what and why. The tavern in the long memory. The tavern remained not glamorous, not prosperous, but essential. It was the village's ledger, its forum, its confessional, and its court. Births were toasted here, deaths were mourned with silence and smoke, marriages were debated, and debts were tracked. And when, one day, the empire changed when Sweden lost territories, or reformed taxes, or sent new officials with new rules, it was here, over dry bread and cloudy ale, that the hamlet would decide how much to obey and how much to forget. A final thought in the stillness. As the snow falls again outside the tavern window, and the talk grows quiet, consider this. Is a society truly powerless if it remembers everything that the powerful forget? Story 7. The Prison Economy of Georgian London. London, sometime in the mid-18th century. The streets are foul and loud, sticky with refuse, spilt porter, and the never-ending clatter of carts. If you follow the Thames eastward, through the haze of coal smoke and the shouting of market boys, you'll find a long, hulking building of brick and stone, Fleet Prison. This is not a place of silence. It is alive with noise, groans, bargains, arguments, singing, and the ring of coins across stone. It is a prison, yes, but it is also something stranger, an economy, a city within a city, a place where money and poverty lived side by side behind bars. Fleet was one of several debtors' prisons in Georgian London, a time when prisons weren't necessarily places of punishment, but of delay. You didn't go to Fleet because you committed a crime. You went because you owed someone money and you couldn't pay it back in time. And inside, the economy kept going. If you had money, you could live in comfort. If you didn't, you could starve just a few feet away. This is the story of how the boring details of debt, bribery, and subsistence became the quiet machinery of survival inside the British Empire's capital. A story not of courtroom drama, but of bed fees, beer cellars, and borrowed candles. The crime of poverty. In Georgian England, especially from the early 1700s through the 1770s, debt was not merely a financial inconvenience, it was a jailable offense. If a merchant, tradesman, or laborer failed to repay a loan or settle an account, their creditor could have them arrested. No trial was required, just an affidavit and a willing court officer. The punishment wasn't flogging or hard labor. Instead, the debtor would be sent to a prison like Fleet, Marshalsea, or King's Bench, often for months or years, until the debt was paid or forgiven. There was no standard sentence length. You could be imprisoned for 6 shillings worth of debt or for thousands of pounds. The system did not discriminate by amount, but it did discriminate by means. Because while the buildings were grim and the smell unbearable inside these prisons, money still ruled. Life inside Fleet Prison. Fleet Prison wasn't the gray dungeon you might imagine. It was more like a badly run inn with a very strict doorman. The prison was divided into sections. The common side for the poor. The master's side for those who could pay extra. And even private rooms or lodgings, available to wealthier debtors with connections. You could rent a bed, hire servants, receive food and drink from outside, and even have your family live with you if you could afford it. Some debtors had entire rooms to themselves. Others slept 10 to a room or curled up in hallways. The key to comfort was simple: coin. Need a blanket? Pay for it. Want to avoid sleeping next to the bucket used as a toilet? Pay for it. Want to avoid beatings from the more desperate prisoners? Bribe someone. The jailer and his fees. The man who truly ran Fleet Prison wasn't the warden or a royal official. It was the jailer, a privately appointed keeper of the prison who made his living not from a salary, but from fees. The jailer charged inmates for entry fees, yes, you had to pay to be admitted. Room fees weekly. Bedding. Ale licenses for those who wanted to run drink stalls. Visitation privileges. Release paperwork. In theory, there were limits on what he could charge. In practice, he charged what he wanted. Corruption was rampant. The jailer had total power over the environment. If he disliked someone or saw an opportunity, he could assign them to the coldest room, double their rent, or restrict their access to visitors. but few prisoners resisted. Why? Because the jailer wasn't just a tyrant. He was also the glue holding the prison economy together. Without his system of bribes and favors, everything would collapse. The tavern within the walls. Yes, Fleet had its own alehouse. In fact, many prisons in London did. The tavern was a source of money for the jailer, who leased it, and a source of escape for inmates who could afford to get drunk instead of depressed. Beer was safer than water, gin was common, tobacco was traded, smoked, and stolen. Some debtors ran small businesses from inside. A tailor might patch clothes for a fee. A writer could draft letters for the illiterate. A clergyman might perform illicit marriages for a few shillings. Some prisoners made a modest income while imprisoned enough to cover their fees, or to send home a little money to their families. Others, with no skills and no help, simply starved. The poor prisoner's lot. If you entered Fleet with no money and no friends, your fate was grim. You would be placed on the common side, where there were no bedding, no privacy, no food unless purchased, no heat. The only sustenance came from alms handouts from charities or wealthier inmates. A handful of churches ran bread lists, donating weekly loaves to those deemed most in need. But even this system was gamed. Jailers often skimmed the donations. Stronger inmates stole food from the weaker. Disease spread easily. Typhus, called jail fever, was common. In the 1720s, one visiting inspector noted that the stench of the common side is such that even vermin flee it. Yet thousands pass through it every year, and many never left. A system built to continue. Fleet Prison was not an anomaly. It was a pillar of Georgian economic life. The wealthy used it to enforce debts and teach lessons to those who couldn't pay. The government allowed it to exist because it cost nothing to run. Inmates paid their own way. The jailers profited from the misery, and the system functioned with quiet efficiency. Reformers protested. Pamphlets were written. Charles Dickens, decades later, would immortalize this cruel logic in Little Dorrit. But in the 18th century, the prison economy continued because it was so boringly effective. Everyone got paid except, of course, the prisoner. And unlike modern jails, release wasn't guaranteed. If no one paid your debt, you could rot indefinitely. A few starved themselves to death on principle. Others slowly paid their way out through prison labor. Most just waited. Waited for a friend, a brother, a creditor's mercy, or the slow shuffle of death. A question in the cold cell. So, as you sit on a damp stone floor in the mind's eye of Fleet Prison, listening to a tavern laugh through thin walls while rats explore your sleeping neighbor's foot, consider: what does it mean to live in a world where freedom has a price tag? And poverty alone is enough to chain you to the wall. You wake to the sound of footsteps and coughing muffled, shuffling echoes in the damp stone hall. The candle stub you kept from last night has burned out. It is dark again in your cell, except for the faint orange glow seeping in from the alehouse on the upper floor. You're still in Fleet Prison, of course. And the day ahead will be like the one before. Food if you can buy it, fees if you can pay them, and waiting, always waiting for something or someone to open the door. But while you wait, the system continues. Not broken, not chaotic, but entirely functional in its own warped way. Fleet and debtor prisons like it were not mistakes. They were intentional extensions of the credit system, and they worked precisely because they made poverty visible, punitive, and most importantly profitable. Today, we peer deeper into the strange, cruel, but astonishingly well-organized inner workings of the prison economy in 18th century London. The creditor's leverage. Unlike today's understanding of prison, being locked in a place like Fleet didn't mean your crime was violent or even morally wrong. It simply meant that you owed someone money and they had the means to call in the law. But that law wasn't designed to rehabilitate or resolve disputes. Its main function was leverage. By having a debtor imprisoned, the creditor gained a psychological and legal upper hand. Once inside Fleet, the debtor couldn't earn normal income. They were humiliated socially. They relied on friends, family, or employers to intervene. For the creditor, imprisonment became a form of negotiation. It said, "You don't have the money now, but someone you know might. So until then, you'll sit in the dark and think about it." Sometimes this worked. A brother would pay off a debt. A former employer would vouch for a reduced sum. Even charity groups sometimes stepped in. But often, the creditor wouldn't recover the full debt, only the satisfaction that the debtor had suffered. Fleet wasn't a financial solution. It was a moral performance of debt. You didn't just owe money, you were meant to feel it. Jail liberties, the rich prisoner's loophole. Some of Fleet's inmates weren't inside the prison at all. If you had money, you could pay for liberties of the Fleet, a kind of geographical extension of the prison grounds, encompassing several nearby streets and houses. Prisoners who paid the appropriate fees were allowed to live outside the prison walls, often in relative comfort, but still under the legal jurisdiction of Fleet. These prisoners had access to private apartments, servants and family visits, business operations, even marriage services. In fact, the liberties became infamous for clandestine weddings. Unscrupulous clergymen conducted thousands of irregular, barely legal marriages, many of them forced or fraudulent. By mid-century, the term Fleet marriage became synonymous with desperation or deceit. These outside-dwelling prisoners still paid the jailer. They still owed their debts, but their experience was entirely different from those on the common side. It was a clear demonstration of Georgian values. Debt was universal, but the consequences of debt entirely class-based. Inside the walls, trade, tension, and tiny triumphs. Within the prison itself, money still moved. Perhaps not large sums, but enough to sustain a miniature economy. Food sellers brought in daily goods, cheese, bread, weak beer, and sold them to those with coin. Cellmates bartered for space, warmth, and privacy. Pawnbrokers occasionally operated discreetly within the walls. Some prisoners made trinkets, lace, or shoe repairs to earn a few pence. There were even loan sharks inside Fleet, offering high-interest loans to desperate prisoners. If you defaulted again, more fees, more isolation. And yet, through this grinding structure, many prisoners managed to survive and even to build routines. Some learned skills. Others reconnected with estranged family members. A few even used the prison as a base of operations, writing letters, planning repayments, managing the slow release of their remaining dignity. It wasn't justice, it wasn't mercy, but it was functional. Prison charity, who helped. While Fleet was mostly self-regulated, outside voices did occasionally intervene, though usually for publicity or political capital. Organizations like the Society for the Relief of Poor Debtors raised money to pay off small debts, often under £5, and secure release for those deemed worthy. Church parishes also ran bread lists, and charities distributed blankets or coal in winter. But help came slowly, and only for a select few. Often, charity depended not on need, but on narrative. If a debtor could write a compelling letter describing their fall from grace, especially one printed in a newspaper or pamphlet, they might find a benefactor. This led to a new genre of writing, the debtor's plea. Printed as broadsides, these stories told of betrayal, illness, bad luck, and virtue punished. They were sentimental, sometimes embellished, but they worked not because people cared, but because they wanted to feel like they cared. Women in the jail. Fleet Prison wasn't just for men. Women could be imprisoned for debt too, and often were. Female prisoners faced the same bleak conditions, but with added dangers. Abuse from jailers or male inmates. Lack of privacy in shared quarters. Separation from children, unless the children were brought in with them. Some women survived by operating small services, laundering, cooking, mending. Others became informal intermediaries, running messages or helping manage the jailer's petty trade in favors and privileges. Women were especially vulnerable, but also often more socially connected. A married woman might have a husband to advocate for her release. A widow might garner public sympathy. A desperate woman might become invisible entirely. For them, the economy of Fleet was not just about survival. It was about maintaining dignity in a place designed to erase it. Debtors' death and burial. If you died in Fleet, and many did, the system continued. A burial cost money. A coffin cost money. Transporting your body outside the prison, more fees. If your friends or family could not pay, your body might be buried in a common pit, nameless and unceremonious. Sometimes prisoners pooled coins to give a fellow inmate a decent burial. More often, the body was taken away with no fanfare. There was no plaque, no marker, only a blank spot in the corridor where your bedroll used to be. And a few hours later, someone else would take your place. The system tightens. By the mid-18th century, Parliament began to debate reforms. Some debtors were deemed poor but honest, and various acts provided for limited release programs. The 1774 Jail Act introduced minimal standards for hygiene and required better separation of prisoners. But the system remained deeply resistant to change. Too many people made money from it. Too many thought poverty meant moral failing. Fleet Prison would not be officially closed until 1842, after nearly 800 years of operation. By then, thousands had passed through its gates. Some stayed for days, others for decades. Very few were ever truly free of it even after they left. A candle in the corridor. So as the tavern bell rings and the jailer makes his evening rounds, pause and consider. What kind of society builds an entire economy inside a prison, and then forgets the people who built it? Outside Fleet Prison, the city changes. Coaches rattle down broader roads. Gaslights flicker in the evening fog. A new generation of merchants, magistrates, and moneylenders shapes London's economy. But inside the prison walls, the same dull rituals continue: fees collected, pence bartered, names scratched into damp stone. The 18th century is drawing to a close, and with it, the world that made Fleet Prison possible is beginning to fracture. Slowly, unevenly, and not always for the better. Because systems like this don't die all at once. They rust. They sag. They are chipped away by reformers with pens, by ministers with good intentions, and by public outrage when outrage is fashionable. Until one day, someone turns the key and realizes it's no longer needed. This final section explores the slow unraveling of the debtor's prison system, how Fleet declined, why reform finally arrived, and what legacy remained in the quiet corners of modern economics. The turning of the tide. By the late 1700s, critics of the debtor prison system were growing louder. Pamphleteers, preachers, and satirists began to turn public opinion. They asked why a man should be imprisoned for owing money he clearly could not pay. They mocked the idea of jailing the poor while the rich moved freely. And then there was the sheer scale of the problem. By 1800, over 10,000 people a year were being imprisoned for debt in England. Fleet, King's Bench, and Marshalsea were overflowing. Jail fever, likely typhus, continued to claim lives. Children were still being born in cells. Reports emerged of entire families living for years inside, their lives reduced to routines of squalor and pleading. A few escaped, literally Fleet, being poorly secured, had numerous cases of bribed jailers, smuggled ladders, and costumed departures. But most did not. They aged in place, becoming fixtures of the prison economy. The woman who patched coats for coppers. the blind man who played fiddle for beer, the former merchant who still carried a ledger, updating imaginary accounts. These stories began to appear in newspapers. The public began to feel, if not outrage, at least discomfort. And discomfort, in time, leads to reform. The push for change. Several factors pushed Parliament to act. Economic logic. It was increasingly clear that imprisoning debtors was ineffective. If they couldn't work, they couldn't pay. Humanitarian pressure. Evangelical reformers, inspired by the same religious movement that would later fuel abolitionism, began advocating for debtor rights. Public embarrassment. Scandals involving rich men jailing rivals for trivial debts embarrassed the system. The Debtors Act of 1813 was a critical step. It allowed for release of debtors owing under £20, simplified petitions for insolvency, the beginnings of a shift from prison punishment to civil debt resolution. Fleet Prison, meanwhile, struggled. Its walls decayed. The jailer's powers were reduced. The internal economy persisted, but with less vigor. By the 1830s, the building was more anachronism than institution. Charles Dickens and the power of exposure. Few voices shaped the public imagination of debtor prisons like Charles Dickens. As a boy, Dickens' own father was imprisoned in Marshalsea for debt. Young Charles, forced to work in a blacking factory while his family languished inside, never forgot the humiliation. In his adult life, he turned that memory into fiction, especially in Little Dorrit, a novel largely set in a debtor's prison. Dickens' portrayal was neither melodramatic nor sanitized. He showed the quiet cruelty of the system. The bureaucracy. The circular logic. The way lives were wasted not through violence, but through delay. Little Dorrit wasn't a call to arms. It was a mirror held up to England's economic soul. And people looked. The final years of Fleet Prison. By 1840, Fleet was half empty. Its walls were cracked, its economy faltering. The jailer had fewer privileges. The surrounding liberties were being absorbed into the growing city. The prison itself, once feared and despised, was now simply irrelevant. In 1842, Fleet was officially closed. Its prisoners were moved. Its records archived. Its building eventually demolished. No ceremony, no apology, no compensation. Just a door closed on 6 centuries of economic containment. What replaced it? Debtor imprisonment did not disappear overnight. But over the next 50 years, the law shifted. Debtors were increasingly handled through civil courts. Bankruptcy became a formal process. The idea of financial rehabilitation gained legal standing. By the end of the 19th century, imprisonment for debt had become the exception, not the rule. But debt itself, its burdens, its stratifications, its ability to shape lives without lifting a finger never went away. It just moved out of sight, into courtrooms, into ledgers, into credit scores, into letters from banks that begin, "We regret to inform you." The modern echo. Even now, you can find the ghosts of Fleet Prison. In payday loans and interest traps. In fines that lead to jail time when unpaid. In prison commissary systems where inmates pay for soap and phone calls. In a society where the line between poverty and criminality remains thin and negotiable. The economy inside Fleet worked because it reflected the larger one outside. And while the bricks are gone, the logic remains. That you can owe more than money. That systems don't have to break to be unjust. And that the most successful prisons never need bars. Final reflection: what freedom costs. So now, as the cell doors hang open and the last fees are counted, a question lingers. If a society defines freedom as the absence of chains, but still charges rent for every breath a poor man takes, can it truly say it ever unlocked the door? Story 8. Between the Plow and the Cross. The forgotten monastic farmers of medieval Bavaria. The bells ring at dawn, low and slow, cutting through the mist that clings to the foothills of the Bavarian Alps. It is the 11th century, and the world here moves according to rhythms older than memory. The tolling of time, the planting of grain, the quiet churn of human labor against God's earth. At the edge of a forest clearing sits a monastery, stone-walled and wood-roofed, not yet weathered to the smooth gray of centuries, but already well-worn. It is home to perhaps 24 Benedictine monks and a small handful of lay brothers and hired peasants. They live between the plow and the cross, devoted to both prayer and agriculture, the two great duties of the land-bound Christian. Here in medieval Bavaria, you would not know that Europe is simmering with crusades, court intrigues, or theological debates. Those things feel distant, abstract. More immediate are the state of the wheat fields, the calving of the monastery cow, the slow repairs of the water mill after last month's storm, and the rule of Saint Benedict, dictating when to rise, when to pray, and when to dig, shear, sow, and reap. This story explores a quiet kind of history, the boring but essential world of monastic farming. A history not of kings or saints, but of muddy boots, wooden spades, and rhythmic chant. The monastic ideal. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, shaped monastic life across Europe. It demanded obedience, stability, a balanced life of ora et labora, prayer and work. While popular imagination often pictures monks as scholars or scribes, the majority were agrarian. Especially in rural regions like Bavaria, monasteries functioned as working farms, producing not just food but tools, textiles, and even surplus for trade. Each day was structured with 8 canonical hours periods of prayer spaced from before sunrise to after sunset. But between these devotions, monks worked the land. They planted barley and beans, kept bees, raised pigs, and harvested flax. Their lives were not idle. They were rooted, literal, and hard-won. The layout of a working monastery. The typical Benedictine monastery in 11th century Bavaria had a practical layout, designed not just for spiritual reflection but economic productivity. Within the cloistered walls, a church and chapter house, a dormitory and refectory, dining hall, a scriptorium for copying manuscripts, workshops, blacksmiths, cobblers, carpenters, a medicinal herb garden. Beyond the inner compound, however, sprawled the monastic granges, large plots of cultivated land, managed by lay brothers or hired peasants. The monks supervised these lands. Some toiled in them directly. Others managed labor schedules, inspected harvests, or operated mills and brewhouses. A monastery might hold dozens of these granges across the region, gifted by nobles in exchange for prayers and favor. Thus, land, not gold, was the true wealth of the monastery, and its tilling the sacred duty. The work of the day. A typical day might unfold like this. Midnight matins, the first prayer service in the cold dark. Bleary, half-woken voices chant psalms. Dawn lauds, then a hasty meal, bread, maybe broth, before work begins. Morning, some monks copy texts or tend bees. Others join lay workers in the fields, planting turnips, mending fences, leading oxen. Midday, sex prayers, then a larger meal, silence observed. Afternoon, more labor, shearing sheep, clearing brush, drawing water, supervision of tenants. Evening, vespers, then compline and rest. There were no weekends, no holidays save feast days. The schedule was strict but not brutal. Benedict warned against overwork, commanding moderation and rest as needed. Still, the labor was real, and its results visible in calloused hands, sunburnt necks, and sore knees. Agricultural knowledge passed in silence. These monks were not innovators, but they were excellent preservers of knowledge. Crop rotation, composting, animal husbandry, irrigation, all were taught not in books, though some were recorded, but in practice. New monks learned by watching, by doing, and by being corrected silently in the field by older brothers. Seed saving was a communal task. Rainfall was recorded by marks on the doorframe. Soil was known by smell and pressure underfoot. Tools were made and mended by hand. Mistakes like a rotted haystack or botched cider barrel were felt not as punishments, but as gaps in spiritual discipline. God, it was believed, saw not just the soul but the field and how you left it. Peasants, patrons, and power. Though monks took vows of poverty, monasteries themselves were often land-rich. Local nobles donated land, livestock, or rights to nearby woods and mills. In return, they received masses said in perpetuity, burial in the abbey grounds, prestige among their peers. This meant monks often oversaw tenant peasants, managing rents and enforcing obligations. Sometimes this created tension. Monks, bound by humility, were also landlords and tax collectors. But many monasteries were careful to keep peace with local villagers. They provided food in times of famine, medical herbs, employment during lean seasons, spiritual instruction. The relationship was transactional, yes, but not heartless. The monastery was both anchor and overseer, always watching, always needed. Insects, ice, and interference. Not every harvest succeeded. Pests, beetles, locusts, rats could ruin barley stores. Frosts came early. Floods washed away plantings. A sick ox could halt plowing for weeks. And sometimes visiting bishops or noble entourages would arrive unannounced, consuming weeks' worth of supplies in days. Monks did not despair loudly. They recorded failures in plain script. In the year of our Lord 1027, the wheat was spoiled by rot. God's hand tests the faithful. They adjusted, replanted, borrowed from neighboring abbeys, made soup from cabbage and nettles instead of meat. The goal was not prosperity, it was endurance. And the fields, like the soul, needed tending, even when the yield was meager. A thought beneath the apple tree. So, as the sun sets over the cloister orchard, and the last chants of Compline fade into the night, ask yourself, if a man spends his whole life in prayer and plowing, with no ambition beyond a well-cut furrow, did he change the world, or simply keep it from falling apart? Dawn again. The bell tolls, the monks rise, and the steady rhythm of the day begins not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Another prayer, another furrow, another day tending not only the soil, but the machine of monastic survival. This isn't a machine of gears and pistons. It is slower, quieter. It runs on habit and repetition, on discipline, on the long memory of men who do not raise their voices, and who believe that consistency is closer to holiness than brilliance ever will be. In this section, we move deeper into the systems that made a Benedictine monastery not just a place of worship, but a working, humming, economic organism, an engine of agriculture, commerce, and quiet negotiation with the outside world. A monastery of many roles. To the outsider, a monastery may have seemed like a place apart, detached from worldly matters, but in practice, it was anything but. Each monk had a job, and that job fit into a wider order. The monastery had a cellarer who managed food and drink, a sacrist who cared for the chapel and vestments, a refectorian who oversaw meals, a librarian or armarius who managed the scriptorium, a forester who monitored woods and lumber needs, and perhaps most importantly, a prior agricola, the monk responsible for coordinating farm labor, often managing multiple granges. This wasn't bureaucracy for the sake of hierarchy. It was a response to the complex reality of running a large agricultural estate while still observing the canonical hours and keeping vows of poverty and humility. The monastery ran like a machine of human parts, each man a cog, quiet, interchangeable, and trained by repetition rather than ambition. And like a well-kept plow when it worked without friction. The lay brothers, labor without the choir. Not all within the monastery were choir monks, those who chanted the daily offices and copied sacred texts. Many were lay brothers, or conversi, men of peasant background who took religious vows but were illiterate or unsuited to spiritual study. These brothers did the heaviest physical work: herding sheep, hauling wood, thrashing grain, digging ditches, building barns. They were considered spiritually equal but functionally separate. Lay brothers lived on a different schedule, praying fewer hours so they could labor longer. They dined in separate halls. They rarely entered the main chapel. Their reward was purpose, shelter, and salvation, offered through mud and muscle rather than music and ink. In this way, the monastery absorbed not just land, but labor class, transforming rural peasants into men of devotion, whose holiness was measured in cartloads and calices. The market days. Once every few weeks, a cart from the monastery would head to a nearby town laden with surplus barley, wheels of cheese, beeswax candles, honey, herbs, vinegar, occasionally wine or preserved fish. This was not free trade. Monasteries were tax-exempt, which made them powerful competitors and sometimes resented. But they treaded carefully. The goal wasn't to grow wealthy, but to maintain self-sufficiency. Profits were used to repair buildings, buy salt or iron tools, pay for scribes, physicians, or rare supplies, help poorer parishes under the monastery's care. Trade was conducted by lay servants or assigned monks, always polite, always measured, never haggling. A monk's role was not to maximize profit, but to steward abundance without becoming greedy. This delicate balance between need and renunciation was the heart of monastic economics. The archive of soil and ink. Some monasteries became repositories of agricultural knowledge. While most of their learning was oral and experiential, certain houses, especially larger Benedictine abbeys, began to keep written records. Crop yields, rainfall patterns, animal births and deaths, costs of grain in local markets, tools repaired or replaced. These weren't scientific in the modern sense, but they represented a remarkable form of long-term observation. One 12th century Bavarian monastery recorded the appearance of a new disease in its sheep flocks, noting its symptoms and possible herbal remedies. Another tracked 3 decades of wine production, noting frost years and rainfall. In an age where most peasants could neither read nor write, the monastery became a living memory of the land itself. Monks and management, the burden of authority. While monks lived humble lives, the monastery as an institution often owned vast lands. Dozens of tenant families might live on monastic property, bound by feudal obligation to provide rents, labor, or military service. This created a tension. The rule of Benedict demanded humility, gentleness, and compassion, but managing peasants required collecting tithes, adjudicating disputes, enforcing boundaries and obligations. Some monks leaned toward leniency, others toward rigor. A few, especially those from noble families, struggled to balance their monastic vows with the habits of command. Conflicts occasionally flared. Peasants resisting new levies. Accusations of unjust rents. Disputes over access to shared pastures or woodlands. Monasteries often tried to resolve these quietly through arbitration or appeals to the bishop, but sometimes they simply absorbed losses rather than risk scandal or unrest. After all, the monastery's greatest power lay not in enforcement, but in its reputation. Invasion, fire, and famine. Bavarian monasteries faced constant external threats. The 11th and 12th centuries saw raids from Hungarian and Slavic tribes, fires sparked by dry summers and wooden roofs, periodic famines caused by crop failure or war, plagues of cattle or swarms of locusts. Monks could not fight, but they could prepare. They built granaries, dug ditches, planted hardier grains. They learned to save seed and salt meat. They created networks with other monasteries, exchanging surplus, news, and support. Even disaster, when it came, was endured with a kind of resigned clarity. The Benedictine life didn't promise safety, it promised structure, and structure, they believed, could survive anything. A question in the grain barn. As you stand in the dim warmth of the grain barn, the floor thick with the dust of harvest, the air filled with the smell of old wood and barley, you might wonder if no one remembers the hands that planted the seed, only the abbey that rose above the valley, who truly nourished the world. The bells still ring, but their sound carries differently, now thinner, more hollow, drifting across fields that have become unfamiliar. The wind stirs old oak trees planted by long-dead hands. The paths are still there, barely, under moss and weeds. The fields still green in spring. But the monks, fewer now. Their world is beginning to shift. The monastic farmer, once a central figure in Bavaria's medieval economy, spiritual life, and agricultural stability, begins to fade, not from sudden disaster, but from a slow unraveling. In this final section, we follow the decline of the monastic agricultural system, from quiet reforms to violent disruptions, and explore what remains not in ruins, but in rhythms still echoing in how we understand land, labor, and purpose. Seeds of change. By the 13th and 14th centuries, monastic life in Bavaria had reached its peak. Wealthy abbeys, well-run granges, productive fields, and steady influence in local affairs. Monasteries continued to operate as centers of landholding, agricultural management, and spiritual care. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Demographic shifts. As populations grew in surrounding towns, monasteries found it harder to retain lay brothers. Labor shortages became common. Spiritual fatigue. The monastic life, once a radical rejection of worldly affairs, was becoming institutional, even comfortable. Economic competition. Secular landlords and new urban economies were more aggressive, more flexible, and more profitable. Monasteries still survived, but their centrality began to erode. They became part of the backdrop, rather than the engine of rural life. The Black Death and the empty cloister. Then came the plague. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe. It did not spare the monks. Many small Bavarian houses lost half or more of their populations. Fields went unplowed, orchards withered, granges were abandoned. The chants of matins fell silent in empty chapels. Some monasteries never recovered. Others restructured. They leased land to tenants rather than managing it directly, reduced herd sizes, and stopped intensive cultivation, replaced lost lay brothers with hired secular workers. This shift marked a profound change. Monasteries had once embodied self-sufficiency. Now they were becoming landlords more than laborers. It was a quiet, reluctant pivot from dirt under the fingernails devotion to something more administrative. The printing press and the voice of doubt. The 15th century brought another disruption, the printing press. Books once copied laboriously by monks became common and portable. Literacy spread. Ideas moved faster. Critics of monastic wealth, some within the church, others outside, began to question. Why did monasteries hold so much land? Why were so many monks idle while peasants toiled? What spiritual value came from grain quotas and wool taxes? These weren't new complaints, but now they had an audience. Monasteries had once been guardians of knowledge. Now they faced a world where knowledge no longer needed guardians. The Reformation and the breaking of the fields. The 16th century shattered the monastic world in ways slow decline never could. When Martin Luther's ideas took hold in German lands, they were not just theological, they were economic and political, and they hit monastic landholdings especially hard. In Bavaria, still predominantly Catholic, many monasteries survived, but in neighboring regions, monks were expelled. Monastic lands were seized by nobles or city-states. Granges were converted into private farms or estates. Libraries were burned, bells melted, chapels turned to barns. To reformers, monasteries represented corruption and waste. To peasants and nobles, they represented opportunity, land, wealth, and labor systems ready to be claimed. To the monks who remained, it was a time of confusion. Some quietly adapted, some resisted, others simply vanished, absorbed into the tide of a Europe that no longer needed men who prayed and plowed in silence. Aftermath: what was left? By the 18th century, the Benedictine agricultural model had mostly disappeared. Some monasteries continued as seminaries or spiritual retreats. A few maintained farms, but more as historic traditions than economic engines. The once complex system of lay-brother labor, rotating grange cycles, mill-centered economies, seed-saving records, was reduced to footnotes in charters and fatting grooves in the land. But something remained. The monastic farming tradition had preserved agricultural knowledge through chaotic centuries, provided economic stability during feudal fragmentation, offered alternatives to peasant serfdom at least in theory, embedded the idea that work and worship could coexist in meaningful, cyclical balance. Modern farming owes something to this, not in technique, perhaps, but in sensibility. That to tend land is more than profit. That time can be measured in seasons, not minutes. That memory can live in fences, footpaths, and furrows. Echoes in the present. You can still visit former monastic farms in Bavaria. Some are museums, others are vineyards, a few are still religious institutions. Many are just quiet rural estates, their abbey walls repurposed as homes, barns, or schools. But if you walk out into the old orchard, or the barley field that hasn't changed shape in 700 years, you'll see it. The land remembers. And if you sit long enough, you might hear it not in Gregorian chant, but in the rustle of grain, the call of distant bells, and the low hum of work that doesn't need to be noticed to be holy. Final reflection: a world held together by the forgotten. So now, as the last Benedictine farmer lays down his spade, and the chant fades behind him, consider: what if the most important work in history was done by those who never left the valley, never wrote a book, and never once raised their voice, but who kept the fields ready for everything that came after?